On what seemed like a perfectly ordinary night, he had a dream that was not so ordinary, but rather strange, one might even say. This dream seemed not only extremely strange to our hero, but also unimaginably wonderful. Our hero was not entirely sure, but it seemed to him that the place in his dream was called Earth. In this dream, there was a man who was absorbed in a computer game for hundreds or even thousands of hours, and information whose meaning was completely unknown kept popping into our hero's head. Looking at the man in his dream, he did not understand why he would spend so much of his precious time on such entertainment. Suddenly, the man who was playing cried out and seemed to be furious that his character in the computer game had lost his life. This man touched the computer mouse with trembling hands and caught himself thinking that it was time to stop, but he couldn't, and promised himself again that this would be his last attempt at success. Suddenly, a voice from the computer addressed this man named Ye Banmin, stating that he had died again in the game. But Ye Banmin leaned back in his chair and said that it was true, but that he was already returning to the game, using slang. He told his fellow player that this time, the cause of his death was a mine, and last time, it was a poisoned arrow. He also said that last time, he was doomed to die from a counterattack because he was stupid enough to stand still. It turned out that he had intended to defeat the monster in the game, but had miscalculated his strength and had to die. He also told his friend that the most ridiculous death was opening a chest that released a poison incompatible with life in the game. At that time, death from a monster or due to a mistake by a game ally became a common occurrence for Ye Banmin. There were various moments of his death in the game, and even ones where he could lose his life simply by slipping on slippery ground. Then he and his friend began to laughingly discuss his death from the jealousy of a girl in the game, or from drinking poison that was intended for someone else. When Ye Banmin's friend told him that he found it all strange because it happened to one person, Ye Banmin reached for another can of energy drink to get rid of his sleepiness and feel alert, saying that it was just a game. And then, despite all these moments, he still wanted to continue the game by trying again. Meanwhile, the Master of Dreams approached the player and noticed that Ye Banmin said the name of the game was Battle of Demons. He told his friend that he intended to play again in order to save the life of a minor character named Evan Deschardin. But for the Master of Dreams, this was unthinkable and incomprehensible because he had encountered something like this for the first time in his life. Suddenly, our hero's expression changed when he heard the name just mentioned by Ye Banmin, as if it was clearly very familiar to him. And then he listened again, hoping that he had simply imagined the name he had heard. The player himself, reading the game manual, said that the main character of this game has several scenarios for his death, and this is standard for every boss. But the owner of the dream still could not understand why Ye Banmin kept mentioning a name that was painfully familiar to him. Ye Banmin himself continued to say that the whole world was eager for Evan's death, and that there were rumors that it was impossible to finish the game before that moment. But the person on the other end of the phone said that there were rumors about this, and that there was even a fan club dedicated to it. And the words that some players like to watch this man die shocked the man who was watching them even more. Then there were also words that there are people who are tirelessly trying to save Evan's life. And they are trying to do this even though he simply continues to die over and over again. It turned out that it was this character that Ye Banmin had been playing all along. It turned out that Evan Deschardin was the very observer who had been standing behind Ye Banmin all along. And now, back in the present, the servant ran into the room in utter horror, addressing his master, but he sat in his bed with his head down, not yet coming to his senses. He began to ask the servant why he was there, not understanding where he was at all. But the servant was worried about him and explains that he had probably just had a real nightmare. But he began to touch his cheeks and continued to ask questions about his identity because he still did not understand anything. Meanwhile, the servants exchanged glances, also completely baffled by what was going on. Then the servants began to pull back the curtains from the window to let in the sunlight and explained that he was the second son of the Marquis de Chardin. And then, upon hearing this, he realized that he was Evan Deschardin. He grabbed his head and realized that his memories had merged into one. While the servants still did not understand what was happening, he ran to the mirror and realized that what he thought was a dream was probably not one. He realized that these were memories from his past life. He was an ordinary man who lived on Earth as Ye Banmin, and he realized that for some unknown reason, Ye Banmin's memories had stayed with him. He looked at himself in the mirror and realized that at that moment, he was a child of only 9 years old. He couldn't help but notice the place where he now found himself and which was now his home. The place around him was exactly like the game Ye Banmin used to play. The servants were confused because they did not understand what was happening to their master. Evan Deschardin himself understood that the day Ye Banmin had spoken of, The day of his inevitable death was not far off. He understood that he had ended up in the everyday life of Evan Deschardin. The servants watched his actions and asked him to explain what was happening to their master. He himself shouted that he could not sit idly by and silently await his demise. Finally, he came to his senses and realized that if his memories were indeed true, now was not the best time to think about it. And then he promised himself that, despite everything, he would become a statistician who would not perish. Meanwhile, Ye Banmin continued to play and rejoiced that he had been able to defeat the demon while playing as Evan. But suddenly, a voice unknown to him asked him if he really thought he would survive. And then a weapon popped out of his computer screen and pierced his chest. And then that scary voice with red eyes said that his fate was death. It turned out that it was another nightmare that haunted poor Evan, preventing him from sleeping peacefully. He jumped out of bed and, looking at his hands, realized that it was just a dream that had nothing to do with his reality. He thought that perhaps this was happening because he had awakened in this world with memories from his past life. Looking at himself, he realized that the body of a 9-year-old child seemed completely weak and unfamiliar to him. Clenching his hand into a fist, he realized that he was feeling all of this very realistically. And now, he was no longer Ye Banmin from Earth, but Evan Deschardin, who lived in a city that resembled an underground labyrinth. He thought about his thoughts about his death, because according to the game, it was his destiny. And what's more, in different scenarios. Perhaps you could call this world a completely different reality. But the problem was that it looked exactly the same as in that computer game. And then the hysteria caught up with him after all, because he simply had no plan for his next steps. Then he pulled himself together and began pacing the room, trying to think like an adult rather than a 9-year-old boy. He understood that he was capable of thinking rationally because his brain was that of a 20-year-old, despite his 9-year-old body. First, he decided to write down all his memories on paper, trying to find the key to understanding how to survive. He noticed a loose notebook that looked like a completely ordinary book. In fact, it was a magical artifact whose contents could only be read by its owner. He began to write down what Ye Banmin had heard about this series of games at the age of 16. The game was released when he was still a student, and it was truly innovative and interesting. But somehow, he always ended up being a secondary character who was destined to die. And that character was Evan Deschardin, who constantly died no matter the circumstances. He understood that if this game and this character were invented, there must be a way for him to save his life. He promised himself to survive at any cost and be reborn again and again until he could complete this journey. Even though this guy was born insanely handsome, every girl still ended up sick, which took his life. And sometimes he even thought that this was definitely a joke by the scriptwriters who created the game, because such a thing definitely does not happen. In the end, this hero has 5 endings to his life and was a very devoted person who could protect others with his own body. He couldn't come up with a solution to the problem and just screamed in despair. Another option for his death was that he committed suicide after his fiancée broke off their engagement. He understood that the player of this game was quite enlightened and knew many details that could happen, and it always turned out that Evan couldn't survive. From Ye Banmin's memories, it was also not difficult to understand that he was able to bring his character to the final battle, where his ultimate demise occurred. Finally, he realized that he had found the solution and jumped up with joy, scaring the servants. Turning around, he saw a girl who had broken a cup of tea in fright and apologized for it. Looking at her, he realized that the maid's face seemed painfully familiar to him. He thought hard, straining his mind and memories of her in the hope of remembering her name. Suddenly, he remembered that her name was Mabel and apologized for scaring her, to which she replied that she would replace everything that had been broken right away. He remembered that when Mabel grew up, she would fall in love with him and stab him with a weapon in a fit of jealousy. But now, looking at her, he couldn't believe that this was the same Mabel. He understood that Evan stood out only for his beauty, and as a result, was good at winning women's hearts. He understood that even in his own home, he could not be safe, and that it would be very difficult to reach the final battle and survive. It annoyed him that he was not a player, but simply a minor character in the game. Mabel did not keep him waiting long, and it was not long before she returned with food for Evan. At that moment, Evan realized that he could not allow himself to die, and so his initial plan was to become an extra who would never die. It turned out that this was a world where mythical dungeons existed. Ferocious monsters roamed this land, and knights honed their sword skills to deal with them. Magicians, in turn, are busy studying more fantastic spells. Evan sipped his tea and realized that the best solution now would be to raise his level. In this world, level is an indicator of status, and a higher level also increases a mage's mana. This also makes fighters stronger, thereby increasing their survivability. The maid distracted him from his thoughts and asked if he intended to go to the dungeon. Then she started screaming that it was completely impossible because Milady would fly into a rage if she found out. He replied that he was just thinking and talking about it out loud, but she shouted that he was not allowed to even think about it because the dungeon was teeming with various monsters. Then she noted that he would still have to go there when he came of age, but until that happened, he had to train. And then, with a complete change of expression, she began to say that he should not leave this place now. But in fact, this idea was part of his plans for the future. Talking about it out loud was also part of the plan to see the maid's reaction. And the plan worked, because as soon as he uttered the word level, she immediately started talking about the dungeon. He understood that people in this world had obvious problems with knowledge, and since he had lived in this body for 9 years, he knew this well, and that's why he decided to test this hypothesis using Mabel's reaction. The people of this world are very mistaken in thinking that you can only level up in the dungeon. It turns out that it is not difficult to understand that receiving a blessing from the goddess significantly increases your level. When dungeons first appeared, rumors about this began to spread, and people simply despaired. But their opinion immediately changed when they learned about the treasures and potential for growth that dungeons offered. It was this news that created chaos among the population when people rushed into the dungeons in droves. In order to stop this, the kingdom decided to entrust the dungeons to the nobility, and thus, the dungeon cities appeared. Evan understood that he was one of the Marquis's heirs, and that the person who controlled these places was his father, Solon de Chardin. But now this fact was completely irrelevant, even if it was true that levels were raised by passing underground. In fact, there were other ways to increase levels outside the dungeon. In the Battle of Demons, there are many ways to become stronger, and Evan understood that he could use the methods he had learned while playing the game. He knew that by using them, he would definitely be able to become stronger. But Evan said these words out loud, and the maid, hearing them, demanded an explanation. He turned to her and asked her not to worry about it. Evan understood that even though he was a minor character, he was still one of the most attractive characters in the game. Even at the age of 9, he was unable to hide his charm. And that was enough for Mabel, who was only 13, to fall in love with him right then and there. She told him about his charming smile, which definitely suited him. Evan understood that he would no longer smile at her, because in the future, it could cost him his life. He then realized that even though he was born attractive, he should avoid any romantic situations and encounters. And when he figured out how he could raise his level, he began to think about how he could do so without losing his life. Then Evan asked his maid about his birthday, but she replied that Evan's birthday would be next Wednesday. Telling her that he did not intend to wait any longer, he ordered her to inform his father that he would like to speak with him. She then ran off to report this request to the head maid. In order to begin his journey, he needed to meet with the Marquis de Chardin. He needed to obtain a necklace called Inzils from his father. This was the first artifact found in the Chardin dungeon, and it was given to Evan's family. The problem was that only the main character could obtain this artifact by making a deal with Evan. Evan tried to remember the event that would activate the artifact. The thing is, when Evan tried to activate the necklace, he filled it with mana and began to cast a spell. And that's when thousands of slugs attacked him, which led to his death. The problem was that he was only able to activate the artifact, but did not know how to stop it. Evan's death became such a grand event that it even made the front page of the game channel. Evan's head was spinning with thoughts because it was completely unthinkable to encounter such an effect at the end of the game. But then he remembered that it was during this event that he learned something else about this artifact. Playing as the main character, he was able to defeat all the slugs in order to save Evan. It was then that he noticed a line that stood out among the other notifications. The notification said that by fighting the slugs from Inzel's necklace, it was possible to gain experience points. And these were not the experience points that are usually obtained in the dungeon, but completely different experience points that increase the level of existence. The game world is a world in which every action leads to one result or another, and all of this is called experience. Regardless of whether a character is training or hunting, they still gain experience points simply by repeating the same actions. It is possible to gain experience and develop simply by increasing the character's level of existence, and Evan was aware of this. He remembered the days when he was a player, and along with the dungeon level, he also gained a level of existence. So he knew it was possible. It is also important to note that, unlike the dungeon level, there is no incredible leap in ability growth. There is also a significant feature in all this, because this experience has no limits or restrictions. Suddenly, Mabel returned and said that the young Marquis was waiting for Evan and that the head maid would show him in. Evan turned around and said that he would go to him in a minute so as not to keep him waiting. And as the two of them made their way to the Marquis, Evan thought that if he went into the dungeon right now, he could die instantly. He understood that for hardworking people, hunting was the easiest way to become stronger, but Evan was still too young for that. But there were also weak monsters that even a small child could defeat. He also knew that a first-level character has 100 units of mana and health, and that Inzel's necklace spends 1 unit of mana to summon a slime. Based on this information, Evan understood that he could only summon 100 slugs, which was good, because he would not be able to defeat more than that. And even though slugs give little experience, it was very good if you started accumulating experience from an early age. And when they approached the door, the senior maid knocked and told the Marquis that she and Evan had come for an audience. A rough voice came from the office, indicating that they were allowed to enter. The door opened, and Evan cautiously peeked out from behind it. Marquis Solane de Chardin, head of the Chardin family, greeted his son Evan politely. He said that when he saw Evan, he felt the accumulated fatigue leave his body. Evan understood that right now, he was the Marquis's son, who was mature beyond his years. And so, leaving behind unnecessary conversation and pleasantries, he asked his son to tell him what had brought him there. Arguing that Evan's birthday was coming up soon, he asked to receive his gift a little earlier than that event. His father looked at him and did not understand why he was in such a hurry, and Evan said that he dreamed of receiving a necklace that he had recently seen. His father was surprised by his request, because children Evan's age usually ask for weapons or pets as gifts. Finally, his father realized that he was not talking about ordinary jewelry, but about the Inzel's necklace. Evan looked at him and confirmed that he dreamed of the very necklace with a huge stone in the middle. His father sighed and told his son that he had already spoken to him about this before. He said that the necklace was a family heirloom and that it was not something he could thoughtlessly give to him. Evan seemed to have expected this reaction, but nevertheless knew perfectly well what he should do in such a case. He decided to use his charisma and charm and tearfully begged his father to grant his request. He understood that if he were anyone else, he would have been hit over the head in that very moment. But this child possessed incredible charisma. And then his father thought about it and began to think of excuses for himself, that the relic would remain a relic, and it didn't matter whose hands it was in within his family. He also thought about what he knew about the ability of some artifacts to choose their owners, and it seemed that this was exactly the case. At that moment, he really thought about how the family necklace had chosen his son Evan on its own. And then he softened and promised his son that he would definitely give him this family treasure for his birthday. Evan immediately feigned surprise and delight at his father's gesture. Then he rushed into his arms, saying that he loved his father, the Marquis, very much. But his father's expression suddenly changed, and he asked Evan to remember one thing that he considered very important. He reminded him of the restrictions on the artifacts that could be equipped. But Evan himself did not understand the meaning of this game phrase at all. It turned out that there were many artifacts imbued with magic, ranging from weapons to rings and necklaces. The thing is, regardless of the type of artifact, only 5 items can be used as equipment. This is because there is a limit to the amount of energy from artifacts that a character can withstand. And the fact that the human body cannot withstand more is just a normal game condition. And so his father asked him to take off the necklace and put it back in storage after he needed to use other artifacts. Evan promised him he would, but he knew he would definitely do it as soon as he reached the level he needed. But now the question arose as to how he would be able to track his progress as a character. And even though he didn't yet know how to bring up his status window, he was extremely happy with his success. After recovering from his joy, he began to think about what he should do next and turned the necklace around to get a better look at it. He realized that Evan's previous mistake was that he started using it before subjugating it. Putting the necklace around his fragile child's neck, he realized that he now knew enough about this artifact. He understood that now he was no longer just the foolish Evan from the game, but with his knowledge, everything could turn out perfectly. He cast a spell that activated the necklace that had destroyed Evan last time. At that moment, he felt an unconditional connection with the necklace, and when he concentrated the energy in his hand, he got the desired creature, which appeared in his hand in the same second. But the problem was that he saw not a monster, but a smiling creature that spoke in its own language, which Evan did not understand. And then Evan looked at it and couldn't stop being charmed because this creature was simply adorable. Then he felt pain in his hand and realized that despite their cute appearance, they still attacked. He understood that first-level slugs cause little damage, but if there were 1,000 of them, it could become a real problem. But he understood that now he was completely different, holding the cutest creature in his hand. And then he gathered all his willpower into his fist and began to squeeze it in order to deal with the slug. An important fact is that if you take damage all the time, you can fall into a critical condition. There is a series of attacks available to an opponent in this state that allows them to defeat you with just one blow. Among ordinary players, such an attack is called the final blow. And when he managed to deal with the first slug, he realized that this way, he could save himself in the role of Evan. Time after time, he dealt with the slimes one by one, thereby gaining experience points. And in order to level up, he understood that he had to train slowly, but daily, to become stronger. It looked easy from the outside, but in reality, it drained Evan's stamina and mana. And because Evan was only 9 years old, his body could very soon reach its limit and end up in critical condition. Evan had too many risk factors for his life, so he decided to always keep his stamina and mana above 30%. At some point, he noticed that he was able to deal with the slime much faster than usual. He realized that this only meant that his level of existence had been raised, but he also understood that the level of existence could not rise so rapidly. But it was very difficult to verify this. In fact, it was almost impossible, because he couldn't bring up a window showing his status. Suddenly, he realized that by constantly clenching his hand, he had gained something like his own grip. He tried to understand his body and felt that every time he used mana, his heart contracted, but he had no problems with endurance. He understood that every time he summoned a slug, damage must accumulate on it. Finally, it dawned on him that Evan's stamina was probably many times greater than his mana. After all, this was probably why he didn't feel tired, because his body had high base stamina. He began to think that everything in the game was completely different. And then it dawned on him that he had been doing everything wrong from the start, because Evan was actually a mage and not just a simple player. When Evan shouted in anger after realizing all this, Mabel entered the room and nearly dropped her cup from his scream. She immediately began to find out what had happened to her master and why he had screamed. She began running around him, worried that Evan had hurt himself somewhere. But Evan asked Mabel to leave for a couple of hours because he needed time to think everything through. She agreed and began to carry out his order, but asked him to call her if anything happened. But Evan himself was extremely angry with the game developers at that moment, calling them some not so flattering names. He then thought that even though they wanted to kill Evan as quickly as possible, he couldn't let them do it. And then, with one hand, he dealt with the slugs, and with the other, he began to devise a plan to cultivate the strongest character. First, he decided to focus all his efforts on strengthening his body. He figured that strength training with slugs would give him a synergistic effect. And then he decided to create a book about the structure of this world, just like he did about Evan. He began the book about this world with mythology about demons, and then continued with the history of the politics of all the kingdoms. He decided to add information about the treasures hidden throughout the game world to this book. And of course, he couldn't help but add information about the important and influential characters of this world. He searched every corner of his memory and tried to record everything in minute detail. He did this in order to use everything he could and avoid all possible dangers. But the whole difficulty lay in the fact that he had no right to make mistakes, because he himself had become Evan for real and was not in the game. He decided to compare what was in the game with what was happening in his real world so that he could predict his future. But he also understood that he needed to be extremely careful, because danger was close at hand in the form of the maid Mabel. So he decided that he would no longer smile at her unnecessarily, so that women would not interfere in his life because of his smile. And then he realized that he should focus on training rather than on female characters. Then he made his schedule so he could focus on training his body. This training method incorporates knowledge from Evan's gaming and real life. And then Evan decided to start training immediately in order to become stronger. But dreams about what might happen to him because of his smile and charm would not leave him alone. And every night, he simply could not sleep peacefully, constantly waking up from nightmares, fearing for his life. Morning came, and Mabel, worried about her master, said that he had been acting very strangely lately. One of the maids listened to her, but did not understand what Mabel meant. She said that Evan locked himself in his room and forbade her to enter, and that he no longer smiled at her. She cried bitter tears because Evan used to follow her everywhere, like she was his older sister. But suddenly, one of the servants told Mabel to calm down, because it was not permissible for her to get close to him, as it could end badly for her. But another maid noted that she also thought their master was behaving rather suspiciously. They noticed a change in that he had stopped fooling around, even though he used to do so constantly, like a child. They noticed that Evan seemed to be doing some kind of exercise in the yard that was unknown to them. One of the maids noticed that Evan was constantly clenching something in his hand and suggested that something was bothering him, but the servant boy advised them not to pay attention to it, explaining that all children do things that adults don't understand. But Mabel didn't want to listen to them, and believed that something was definitely wrong because he had changed after his fever. The servant boy looked at Mabel and noted that in this state, she would be of no use at work. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a man who burst in and told them that Evan had managed to lift a huge stone in the garden. He said it was amazing because a normal child would hardly be able to do such a thing. Evan lifted the stone and then put it down again. And when asked what he was doing, he replied that he was using the stone as a weight. Mabel immediately rushed to her young master, but another maid tried to hold her back with all her might, as if she were a running bull. Then the servant boy asked the man if he was sure about what he had seen, and he confirmed it. Later that day, Evan was sitting at a table with someone, stuffing cookies into his mouth. The girl sitting with him had brought these cookies from the land of wizards, especially for Evan. It turned out that this wonderful woman was Evan's mother, Redina de Chardin, who was his father's main wife. She asked him about his recent activities, as he had previously been unable to find time to have tea with his mother. Despite becoming a mother, she still looked very young, and there were rumors that the developer who created her had run away. He then told his mother that he was studying an artifact, which shocked his mother, Redina. It was extremely strange for her to hear this, because he had never told her before that he dreamed of becoming an archmage. But Evan replied that everyone should have their own field in which they could best excel. She smiled and replied that his words seemed too mature to her, and allowed him to continue with his affairs until a year had passed. She also added that in exactly 1 year, he simply wouldn't have time to pursue this. It turned out that in the year, Evan would turn 10, and aristocrats had to be knowledgeable in history and languages, as well as other fields. They also had to be skilled in swordplay and magic, as befitted their status. Training in all these subjects began at the age of 10. Evan was angry with himself because he had completely forgotten about this. His mother also told him that he would have to fulfill the family's duties in addition to his studies. Evan learned from his mother that any nobleman who entered the dungeon must achieve some kind of greatness. Evan knew this very well because most of the situations that led to his death happened there. She smiled and said that it would only happen in a year, and for now, he could study and play whatever he wanted, because that was very important for a child. She suggested that her son Evan visit that city before starting his training. Evan understood that during this year, he had to train on slugs so that he could do anything and anywhere. He set about implementing the second part of his plan and began to search diligently for a character destined for his path in the category of divine people. After digging through his book, he was able to find the character he needed to carry out his plan. It was the Silent Knight of the Night, who was the same age as Evan, but nevertheless one of the strongest characters in the game. His strength and endurance were enough to rival even the main character. But it turned out that this hero also had a very difficult fate. But Evan was happy, because by changing his fate, he would be able to change the fate of the Silent Knight as well. It turned out that the Silent Knight was from the underground city of Chardin, who lost his parents during the overcrowding of the dungeon. In the end, he was simply sold into slavery to a foreign group where he lived a difficult life. But somehow, he managed to sneak into the dungeon and awaken his abilities. But suddenly, Evan thought about that large-scale incident. He thought about his mother's words that he needed to visit this city, but that it was very dangerous there. And then he understood why she had said all those words, because the strongest assassin was right there in this city. And then Evan began to rush towards the exit, mentally asking the Silent Knight to wait for him. Stepping out into the corridor, he called out to Mabel that they should go shopping together right now. All the servants, including Mabel herself, were extremely surprised by their master's order, and before long, they were both in a carriage on their way to the city. Mabel didn't understand what was going on, and remembered that Evan had stopped smiling at her right after saying that. Evan then told Mabel that she was the only person he didn't want to smile at. Mabel clutched her apron nervously and realized that she had to fix things and restore her previous relationship with Evan. To break the silence, Mabel said that due to the overcrowding in the underground, there was probably a shortage of supplies on the street. Mabel was curious about what exactly Evan wanted to buy there, and he replied that his goal was a person. Evan looked out the window and told Mabel that they were heading to the slave market. It wasn't long before they arrived at their destination. Evan looked out the window and realized that because of the incident with the dungeon, there were far fewer people on the streets. Mabel told Evan that when the monsters began to pour out of the dungeon, the city took all the damage. She added that until the city recovered, merchants did not want to come here to trade. She added that the hunt for the escaped monsters was still ongoing. After hearing this, Evan realized that now was indeed a very bad time for shopping. But he also understood that there might not be another chance because the Silent Knight might be bought by that very group. Mabel was also concerned that now was not the time for shopping, let alone buying a slave. Evan reassured Mabel by telling her that they were going to a slave market that was completely legal. But she said that even though the market was legal, no one provided proper care for the slaves, despite it being a condition of the contract. This world had legalized slavery, and when that happened, many things that had previously been condemned disappear. However, in any system, even one like this, people are always able to find loopholes, and there were those who abused the system. Such people aroused the anger of the affected segment of the population, and sometimes they openly rebelled against it. The main defender of this rebellion was one of the main characters of the game, who made the whole world rise up against its true enemy. It is also interesting that wherever she appeared, countless amounts of blood were spilled with the help of her incredible magic. She was nicknamed the Bloody Witch, and Evan was curious about her now, because she was probably just a child like him. Suddenly, Mabel told Evan that they had finally arrived, addressing him as a young gentleman. They got out of the carriage and started walking straight into the building. They were accompanied by Dane, a knight of the House of Chardon, who was worried because they had come without the Marquis's permission. Jokingly, Evan replied that if there were any trouble, he would definitely protect him. Dane said that this place was not at all suitable for Evan's position, but he replied that he had long known how the world worked. Then he turned to Dane and said that he had come to this place to find a certain person he needed. Dane did not understand the need for such actions, believing that Evan only needed to say a word to the Marquis to get what he wanted. Evan said that he intended to figure everything out himself, because in the end, these people would serve him. Then Dane agreed with the maid's words that Evan had changed and was very touched by his words. But in reality, Evan understood that all the people his father had hired before always died along with Evan. As they walked on, Mabel hoped that there would be no girls there who might appeal to her young master. When they entered, the man inside the room was extremely surprised to see Mr. Evan. Evan told him about his intention to look at all the options for sale that this man could offer. Evan explained that he intended to look at all the children available who were approximately the same age as him. Evan said that he knew that this man must have children who had been left without parents due to the disaster. But the man said that these children had sold themselves into slavery in order to survive and were unlikely to meet Evan's requirements. But Evan said that it was precisely these children's desire to continue living that he needed. Evan explained that this was precisely why he was not going to test their determination. Finally, he said that he needed a child who would grow up with him and be ready to protect him when they grew up. After hearing this, the man had no choice but to take Evan to the children. And when Evan was already in the room, sipping fragrant tea, the candidates were already peeking out from the doorway. The man invited them into the room where Evan was, saying that they were all under 12 years old. Evan's attention was immediately drawn to two children, and the man explained that they had quarreled with each other, and therefore had abrasions. He saw a boy with black eyes, black hair, and dark skin, and immediately realized that this child was the knight. He also noticed the girl, who was known for her oppressive infinity and was considered one of the 5 strongest characters. Without hesitation, Evan said he wanted both children. The fact is that these divine people were considered a subspecies of humans that appeared as a result of human mutation. It turned out that compared to ordinary people, their bodies were weaker and their growth rate was many times slower. That is why such people were always treated as losers. But some of these people possessed incredible strength, and at that moment, they were standing right in front of Evan. The children who were standing in front of Evan at that moment were divine beings who would become the Silent Knight and the Bloody Witch in the future. Evan then realized that all this should be called not just luck, but a real miracle and good fortune. Divine people gain twice as much experience when they enter the dungeon. With each new floor of the dungeon, they only become stronger and ultimately become incredibly powerful. But an important fact is that due to their low level of existence, not all of them are able to reach the 5th floor. And then Evan realized that from that moment on, the game's story had changed beyond recognition. Now Evan understood that as long as these children were under his care, nothing would happen to them. And when Evan put the bag of money in front of the man, he said that these children were half the price of the others, and he couldn't take that much. Evan replied that he had absolutely no desire to discuss the price of these children. Evan reiterated his position to the man, saying that he intended to take these 2 children with him. Meanwhile, Evan and Mabel were talking about the hypothetical infidelity of her future boyfriend, to which Mabel said she would kill him if that happened. And so our heroes, now with their company enlarged, headed back. Evan looked at them, noting his luck in this matter, because he had managed to achieve 2 of his goals at once. Not long before, Evan had explained to the merchant what characteristics he was looking for in people, so that he could search for more. Now that the merchant knew the criteria he should look for, it would be easier to find talent among the rest. Evan looked at these children and realized that their images were very different from those in the game's finale. And at that moment, It was very strange for Evan to see them in such a guise. He understood that these children had not yet isolated themselves from the outside world and had not yet had to face real difficulties. Evan also knew that fate had prepared such trials for these orphans that they would not have a moment to cry. He asked them to tell him their names and not to be afraid of him, because he was not going to harm them. The girl introduced herself as Belua and said that her mother called her Lua for short. Evan said he hoped they could become friends, and then he could call her by her mother's nickname. Then the boy introduced himself as Shine. Shine said that they had first seen each other at the market, but only now had he been able to learn her name. Evan also introduced himself in response, expressing politeness and kindness. Suddenly, Shine decided to ask Evan a question that interested him. He was curious as to why Evan had decided to buy such weak children as them. Then he began to assume that Evan wanted to humiliate and insult them with this action. But Evan began his answer by saying that the world was definitely unfair, and the two of them knew that very well. But then he went on to say that he was lucky to be born the second son of the Marquis and lived a completely carefree life. And the words about how Evan called himself lucky made Shane and Bella angry. But then Evan said that they were no less fortunate than he was, but Shine heard only echoes of mockery in his words. He was angry because he was born into a poor family and, being physically weak, was incapable of doing anything. But Evan said that the two of them were very lucky to have a talent that anyone would envy. Shane looked at Evan with eyes wide with surprise, as if demanding an explanation. Bella looked at Evan with the same expression, because she also did not understand what talent he was talking about. Shane couldn't stop being angry, because he thought Evan's words were complete nonsense. Bella beat Shine to it and asked Evan what talent he was talking about. Evan said that they both had a talent that would allow them to become stronger, but Belua said that her mother always apologized for her weakness. Shane said that he had experienced the same thing, agreeing with Belua. Evan replied that their mothers had nothing to apologize for, because their talent was not so easy to recognize. Shane continued to be nervous and angry, because he didn't understand why Evan was so sure of this, and how he knew about it in the first place. He was annoyed because he said that even his own parents never knew about it. Evan explained that it was all because he himself had a special talent. He said that his talent was the ability to find gifted people like them. And of course, at that moment, Evan lied, because he couldn't tell them that he knew the future. These words intrigued little Bella, and she asked Evan if she could become stronger. Evan said that he could prove it to them, but that it would take 3 years, and then they would be able to see for themselves. Evan explained that they could leave at any time if they were disappointed with the result. Shane still did not understand much, because he knew that he was still a slave who would not be allowed to leave. And then he swore by the name of Evan Deschardin that if they were dissatisfied in 3 years, no one would hold them back. But then you went on to say that if he was right and fulfilled his promise, they would have to obey his orders. Finally, Evan asked about their decision and willingness to follow him and trust him. He asked them to trust him so that Evan could fully reveal their talents. Shane and Belua thought about it, because not long ago, they had been chained to the ground and promised themselves to simply survive. Evan promised him that in 3 years, he would be able to thank his parents for giving him such strength and resilience. And when Shine cried, Evan promised him that this would indeed happen. Shane couldn't hold back his tears and said that he dreamed of this happening. Bella, watching all this, cried just as hard as Shine. Evan hugged them around the shoulders as if trying to calm them down, because he understood perfectly well how they were feeling at that moment. But in reality, Evan realized that he had managed to recruit 2 bodyguards for himself at once. But he also understood that until they became stronger, Evan would have to watch over them. When they returned to the palace, they were met by the head maid and her team. She saw before her dirty children in torn clothes. She immediately ordered the maids to take them away to be checked and cleaned up. The knight then explained that what they were seeing was the maid's direct responsibility. He then asked Evan what he intended to do next, but Evan replied that he was going to keep them with him. His plan was to take them all to the dungeon. The knight noted that at such a young age, Evan was capable of winning hearts, because the knight had heard what he said to those boys. The knight also noted that, in his opinion, those 2 children would never betray him. And before long, Shine and Belua were clean and dressed in clothes given to them by the senior maid. When they entered Evan's room, he noted that they both looked much better now. Shane remembered that when they were all in the carriage, Evan had told them that he needed something from them. He was curious what Evan would ask for if he managed to make them stronger. He clarified that Shine thought Evan intended to make them his servants. Evan thought that, as expected, the Silent Knight was different from ordinary children and was thinking about the future rather than what he wanted to do now. And so as not to keep Shane waiting, he replied that he wanted only one thing from them. By saying this, he wanted to indicate that he wanted them to protect him. But for now, Shane and Bella's eyes showed only confusion at what they had heard. They were surprised because they understood that they were still just children, but Evan reminded them that they would soon become incredibly strong. Evan went on to say that thanks to their talents, they would be able to protect him. Evan understood that they were both confused and did not understand why the Marquis's son would need protection. Then he ordered them to always stay close to him when they were not busy with their classes and studies. Hearing all this, Shane suggested that Evan might be in danger in the future and therefore wanted to be protected. Noting Shine's quick wit, Evan said that he was absolutely right. He went on to say that this was precisely why he needed these two. Then Shine asked about the strange sounds that occur when Evan clenches his fist. Evan said that it was a special training exercise that they should not tell anyone about, and said that he was not going to hide anything from them. Bella saw something soft in Evan's hand and thought that she would also like to try squeezing this creature. But Evan looked at her and told her not to worry, because very soon he would be able to defeat higher level monsters. And now, after Evan had told them about his desires, he asked the guys to do the same and tell him about theirs. He said it would be unfair not to know their desires, since he had already told them about his intentions. At that time, Evan thought he had to provide them with comfortable conditions in order to avoid betrayal in the future. And then he told them that since they were responsible for his safety, from now on, he would fulfill their wishes. Shane said that they didn't care what they did, as long as they had a roof over their heads and good food. But suddenly, Shine became serious and said that he dreamed of killing all the monsters who had killed his parents. He dreamed of taking the lives and any right to exist of every single monster. Evan understood that Shine's hatred for monsters probably originated in his early childhood. Even in the game, Shine was the one who continued to live for the destruction of all monsters. Evan then told Shane that everything would happen as he wanted it to, because it simply couldn't be any other way. Then Evan said that in order to become stronger, they needed to go to the dungeon. Shane was worried about whether they would be able to survive by becoming stronger in this way. But Evan said that if they followed his instructions, no one would get hurt. Then Shane knelt before Evan, saying that he would serve him forever if he helped him avenge his parents. Then he turned to Bella with the same question about what she wanted to do. The thing was, when Evan saw her in the battle with the demons, he realized that she was causing people more harm than any monster. And taking Below's life was part of the plot, because she always stood in the player's way. Looking at her, he couldn't understand how such a sweet girl could turn into a woman who wanted to destroy people. But then, Bella replied to Evan that she wanted to become stronger so that she wouldn't freeze or starve, and simply to survive. But Evan came closer to her, and looking her straight in the eyes, said that at 7 years old, she simply hadn't seen much yet, and that she wasn't to blame for anything. He said that she had no need to rush, and that she would definitely find what she was looking for. After hearing this, she calmed down and cheered up, saying that she would not stop searching. And when they had all decided, Evan said he would prepare a special training plan. Evan knew that even if the kids underwent special training, they still wouldn't be able to train on slugs. He thought that there were very few divine people, and even if the birth rate increased, it would not affect the overall picture. And he realized that a great way to make divine people stronger was through skills that could be developed. And so Evan told the guys that they needed to learn skills. He told the guys to remember that once they acquired a skill, they would become stronger. He said that after learning certain skills, they would be able to improve their health, magic, or other physical attributes. Then Evan began to think about the effectiveness of passive skills, which, once acquired, could give them an advantage. An example of this is the Marquis Knights, who wield weapons, because the higher the skill level, the better the level. Evan also assumed that training with heavy weights would help him develop his skills in the future. Of course, Shane and Bella were interested in this information because they dreamed of becoming stronger by any means necessary and were ready for anything. Evan said that there are many ways to acquire skills, but they need to focus on only 2 of them. The first way is to repeat an action until you achieve perfection and acquire a unique ability. The second way is to learn the secret that has been passed down for centuries, from generation to generation in a certain group. Evan indicated that they would use both methods in parallel for the best result. In the past lives, the demon battle players found it strange that butlers and maids had high health and mana stats. It turned out that thanks to the secret art of housekeeping passed down within the family, the servants' stats skyrocketed. Evan said that the guys were lucky again, because the higher the housekeeping skill, the better the abilities become. And they were lucky because the Chardon family's housekeeping skill was the best of its kind in the entire kingdom. Joy appeared in Shane's eyes because he understood that most likely he and Balua would be learning this housekeeping skill.
Evan also tried to explain that even though it was a housekeeping skill, it would not be so easy to acquire. Evan reminded them that compared to other servants, they were physically weaker and would not be able to work on equal terms with them. He went on to say that they would need to put in more effort to match everyone else in strength. Evan said that by achieving this, they would not only improve their mana, but also be able to pave their way to conquering the dungeon. Evan said that he would only help them by pointing them in the right direction, but the decision to follow that path or not was up to them. Talking to these children, Evan understood that he never doubted that they would appreciate his sincerity and straightforwardness. Looking at them, Evan nevertheless clarified their readiness to go all the way in the manner he had suggested. When both Shine and Belua agreed, Evan folded his hands in front of him, showing his readiness for the journey ahead. When Evan called the senior maid, she came with a question about what her master was going to be capricious about this time. But Evan said that he was not going to be capricious, but intended to ask her for a favor. Pointing to Shine and Balua, he asked the maid to teach. The head maid lowered her eyes and did not take these words seriously at all. But then Evan used his charm and tearfully asked his senior maid again. He asked her, saying that these children would serve him all their lives and that this training was very important to him. In the end, the senior maid relented and agreed to her young master's request. She said that she would take care of the girl's education herself and entrust the boy's education to the head butler. She said that the head butler would definitely agree if Evan asked him the same way he had asked her. Suddenly, the butler appeared right behind Evan and Shane. Standing before them was an extremely serious and imposing man who held the position of head butler. Evan rubbed his cheeks and told himself that it would not be difficult to persuade him and that he would have to play the cute card again. Then Evan plucked up his courage and asked the head butler to take care of little Shane's education. Meanwhile, Shane had a dream in which his mother screamed at him to hurry up and run away. Shane then promised himself and his mother that he would survive no matter what. Images of him promising to take revenge flashed through his mind, one after another. Suddenly, someone's voice woke him from his sleep, and he immediately came to his senses. It turned out that it was not a dream, but simply memories that he could not get out of his head while training with the butler. The head butler scolded him for not being able to cope yet and getting tired after the most basic training, but these words only motivated Shane, and he tried his best to complete the tasks because he understood why he needed to do so. The head butler said that endurance was extremely important because the Marquis de Chardin's servant had to learn to help his master. Then he said that after lunch, Shane had a theory class, so he asked him to save his remaining energy. Turning to Evan, the butler said that despite his lack of endurance, Shane was a very talented child. He noted that for his age, he was quite intelligent and sensible and ready to go all the way. And then the head butler said that he was ready to take him on with all seriousness because he had enough healing artifacts in store. Suddenly, Mabel ran up and said that the Marquis de Chardin wished to see Evan. When he came to his father's office, the Marquis noted that Evan had not been to the garden for a long time and asked him why. Evan explained that he was studying the abilities of the pendant, as it was not easy to identify them, and so he was conducting experiments. Then, his father rose from his desk and asked Evan to be extremely careful and not to hurt himself. Then he told Evan that the abilities of his pendant could be improved, which Evan obviously did not know. It turned out that artifacts are capable of developing, and thanks to him, it is possible to unlock new abilities that the owner did not have before. The Marquis said that he himself did not know this until he became its owner and decided to show Evan something. He asked Evan to pay attention to the glow of the gemstone because you can feel the mana reserve hidden inside it. The Marquis said that when the pendant glowed completely, he would be able to understand that its level had been increased. And since the first signs of that glow were visible on it, it meant that there was not much left to achieve the desired result. Evan understood that no one had ever used this artifact in the game, and even he himself thought that this item was of no importance. Evan thought about how the slugs could become stronger as they grew along with his level, and he was afraid that he would not be able to cope with. Evan was confused because he couldn't allow this to happen, but he couldn't finish his training either. Suddenly, he simply stopped worrying about it because they were just slugs. Then his father mentioned that Evan had spent all his savings to hire new servants. His father thought about it and suggested that his son Evan had done it out of pity for them, but Evan said that pity had nothing to do with it and that he was absolutely sure of his choice. He said he was absolutely certain that these two would become stronger and be able to protect him in the future. He also said that this was why he had asked the head maid and the head butler to train them. His father looked out the window and said that from now on, these children were solely Evan's responsibility. By this, he meant that these children could not stay here on their own. After that, when Evan returned, Mabel
begged him to make her his personal servant, but Evan refused. After 3 months, Evan observed the results of Shane and Belua's training and realized that it was an excellent result. The head butler said that the children's endurance had reached the same level as the others, so he decided to bring them here. Evan noted the head butler's good work, despite the fact that the children had to go through torment. Evan understood that the newcomers who had not gone down into the dungeon were very weak, so he told them that it would take 3 years to train them. But Evan could not have imagined that it would take them only 3 months to achieve the initial results. Shine, addressing Evan, said that it would be completely unforgivable on his part not to show the results achieved. Bella also told Evan that she had worked hard to achieve good results. The head butler then said that they could study with the others and spend the rest of their time with Evan. Evan replied that he had brought them there so that they could be with him, and moreover, said that he had work for them. So Evan asked the butler to prepare something important, but not at all difficult for him. Evan gave the head butler a note with his request written on it, and said that he would fulfill any request of his little master. To get a job as a butler or maid, you need to have outstanding abilities, but even that is not enough for the dungeon. But Evan knew of a raider cheat that was available only to him. He opened the chest that the head butler had brought and began to search through it diligently. For Shane, he took out double blades to use as weapons, and for Belua, he prepared a special lamp. Evan said that if these weapons suited them, their bodies would definitely respond. Of course, these were not ordinary items, but real artifacts that were considered antiques in the game and had long been stored away. It turned out that Evan was the only one who knew how to use these antiques, and he immediately began to show his peers how. Evan said that this was definitely the fastest way to hone their skills in using dual blades. He explained step by step that the first thing to do was to cross the blades in a defensive stance. Then you need to bend your knees and lean forward to spread the blades apart. Evan said that it is precisely with these movements and in this sequence that this technique is most effective. Evan told Shane that he needed to hone this skill right away so as not to waste any time. He then began to talk about canceling an attack, which could provide a number of advantages. And in order not to explain the existence of Cheetah to Shane, Evan decided to simply ask him to trust him. Shane's training went more than well, as he was able to master the basic skills of swordplay in just 1 day. But for the girl Belua, using the artifacts proved to be a real problem. Her abilities are related to fire, so he wanted her to train with this artifact. But the problem was that she had to come to this conclusion herself. At first glance, the lamp really looks like an outdated artifact, but thanks to it, one can achieve control over mana balance. Evan explained to the girl that by activating the lamp repeatedly, she would be able to master and hone this skill to control her mana balance. He said that once she mastered this skill, her magical power would change depending on the level. Also, thanks to this lamp, she could obtain an unlimited supply of mana, or spells themselves and their power, as well as the speed of mana regeneration. Evan told her that each time she activated the lamp, it would strengthen her connection to fire magic. In other words, he wanted to tell Bella that if she could befriend the little flame, she would be able to create a real flame. This meant that for Bella, this lamp was the best way to train. Thinking about Evan's words, she realized that she needed to hurry up and light this lamp. But suddenly, Evan's mother entered the room where Bella was and saw the lamp next to her. Bella was shocked to see Mrs. Deschardin in the room. Evan's mother said that Belua should not have taken the lamp from the warehouse. Then she saw that this was the same girl Evan had brought to the palace. Bella told her that Evan had given her the lamp and said that she had to learn how to activate it in order to control mana. But then she sighed at the fact that Evan had given her such a complex artifact. She went on to talk about Evan as a person who had absolutely no talent for magic, but Belua immediately objected. But Madame de Chardin did not understand what Belua meant by this, and looked at her questioningly, as if demanding an explanation. But suddenly, her serious expression changed to a smile, and she decided to help little Belua with her training. Bella watched her as the lady asked her not to tell her son about it. And so, after another 3 months, the second level of training was progressing well, according to Evan. Bella was still able to master mana balance control and even excelled at it, constantly activating the lamp. Shine continued to hone his dual blade skills, training his cutting technique. During these 3 months, Evan also learned to summon 2 slugs at once and deal with them. Initially, he planned to remove the pendant as soon as he managed to raise his level of existence to the desired level. But the realization that the artifact could be upgraded opened up new possibilities for him, such as summoning higher level slugs. Since the slime's level had increased, it was now more difficult to deal with them, but the experience points increased along with them. He thought that if this continued, Mabel's kitchen knife would no longer be a problem for him. Now, Evan had begun survival plan number 3. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chardin told Belua that she had repeatedly tried to teach Evan magic, but all her attempts had been in vain. The third survival plan was to develop immunity to various poisons. Evan thought aloud about the high cost of poisons, since he couldn't access the family budget without his father's permission. But suddenly, Mabel, who was walking behind him, heard these thoughts and asked Evan what exactly he needed the money for. Evan immediately turned around and said that Mabel couldn't become his personal servant, but she could help him with something else. He suggested that she start her own business, but she needed more information first. And then they came to an audience with one person in order to put his plans into action. He came to the Marquis's eldest son, Eric Desjardins, who was curious as to why he had come to him with Mabel. Evan spoke about the task of conducting an inspection in the city that his father had given him when the Marquis's representatives were traveling around the city. Eric understood what Evan was talking about and explained that this was done to demonstrate his leadership qualities. Evan said he wanted to help his brother Eric with this. When Eric said that Evan was still too young for this, Evan said that he had come up with something. When Eric looked at his notes, he covered his mouth with his hand in surprise. Eric thought that these theses had been written under someone's dictation and asked Evan about it. Evan said that these were exclusively his personal conclusions based on his knowledge. Evan understood that his brother Eric was surprised because these notes contained all the events that had taken place in the city over the past 6 months. They also included lists of items that would be needed first and foremost for this purpose. Eric was amazed that it described in detail how to prepare essential products from easily obtainable ingredients. Eric said that with such knowledge, Evan could become an excellent merchant, and Evan said that he intended to start his own business. He said he wanted to earn his own money, but first, he needed to study the city in order to start his business. Obviously, Eric had no objection and suggested that Evan go and ask their father for permission. Less than a minute later, Eric and Evan came to their father for an audience and brought him the notes Evan had made. While the Marquis was reviewing the notes, the two brothers stood humbly and waited for their father's verdict. Their father said that it would be too much work for Evan and that he probably wouldn't be able to handle it on his own. Evan agreed with his father's statement and said he was only willing to do one part of the project. Evan said he was ready to study medicine and hoped that his father would be able to take care of the rest and that he would simply be of assistance. The Marquis said that all this indicated that all these notes had been made in order to show them to him. His father understood perfectly well that Evan had planned to negotiate with him from the very beginning, but Evan said that he just wanted to show him his determination. Then Evan's father and brother began to joke that Evan must really be related to them because he was too brilliant. Then his father said that he intended to call a meeting to expand the business, which had been just an experiment. Evan was happy because his plan had worked, and this turn of events would significantly change the fate of the Chardin family. At the meeting, it was discussed that the reliability of the promised results would be more accurate if they kept the author's name secret. But many did not understand why little Evan should be involved in medicine, since this business would bring minimal income. But his father shared Evan's words that the reason medicine was in decline was because of the priests who were involved in healing. Evan then talks to his father and said that the first thing they should do for the townspeople was to improve the medical industry. And since the temple does not like the idea of healing with anything other than God's powers, they receive large donations for this. The only ones who benefit from this are the dungeon warriors, who earn enough to afford to make donations. Many people need the healing powers of priests, but many of them miss the opportunity to receive treatment. The only option for such people is to take medication immediately. Evan said that they would be able to sell medicine at a low cost if they managed to bring the medical industry to the top. And because his father believed that this would reduce mortality in poor areas, he would support this plan. He said that the line of potions would be produced under the name of the Marquis. He said at the meeting that once they had decided on this, the church would not be able to stop them, and the townspeople would willingly accept the idea. When the meeting ended, Evan and his brother stopped their father in the hallway. He asked him about the church and whether everything would be all right. The Marquis said that he would definitely talk to the emperor, because his son had expressed a desire to help the townspeople, and the Marquis could not help but support him. Then he told his sons that he gave his blessing to the development of medicine and pharmacy. Evan jumped on his father with joy, intending to hug him as tightly as he could. Evan thanked his father, although in reality, he had completely different goals. He understood that caring for the townspeople was a very good idea, but his own health was his priority. When Eric asked Evan where he wanted to start, he replied that his assistant Mabel would be in charge of everything. As soon as permission was received from the Marquis, they immediately set to work, and all they needed was to keep the business afloat. But as it turned out, there was simply no pharmacist. And then Evan realized how powerful the church was in this place. And since there was no pharmacist in the game, they always had to look for an alchemist who could prepare health potions. Another option was for the player to develop alchemy skills on their own in order to make potions for themselves.
Evan understood that he needed to solve the problem and learn how to make potions himself. But the problem was that no one would buy potions made by a child. Then he thought about training with a pharmacist and then creating a situation where he could show off his talent for making medicine. He then decided to reveal the very recipe for making potions from the game. But the problem was that Evan still hadn't found a pharmacist, and suddenly, Shine knocked on his door. When he entered the room, Evan demanded a report on whether Shine had found someone suitable. Shine said he hadn't found a pharmacist, but he had met someone who could help them in their search for the right person. Evan was surprised to see the owner of the slave market standing in front of him. Suddenly, he said that there were pharmacists outside the city who would be suitable for them. He gave Evan a whole list of candidates and decided that it would be better for Evan to meet him in person because he was in charge of this project. Evan was amazed because the market owner had prepared thoroughly and clearly considered him to be no ordinary person. Finally, Evan saw a person on the list who interested him and asked the market owner to bring him to him. This person on the list was Bernard Garcia, who was 63 years old. This man lives in the forest and sometimes sells herbs in the village while possessing extensive knowledge about herbs and not asking for much money for his herbs. When the market owner suggested looking for someone else, Evan became nervous and ordered him to be brought there with all honors. Shane noted that most likely, his master had seen something special in him, again, just as he had in Bellowa at one time. It turned out that Bernard Garcia was the greatest hero among the alchemists in the second part of the battle against the demons. Evan couldn't imagine that the same legendary non-player character would appear in the third part of the game, and he knew he couldn't let him get away. 4 days passed, and Evan finally waited for the appearance of the alchemist Bernard, whom he so desired. But the alchemist burst into the room, saying that he knew nothing about alchemy and calling Evan some not-so-nice names. At that moment, Evan, noticing Bernard's height, stood silently, and the market owner said that he had no right to speak that way to the Marquis's son. He also whispered to Evan that he had brought him an assistant as kind as Evan had requested. This kind assistant was a girl from the Brotherhood's pharmacy named Hannah. Shane turned to the old man and asked him to show more respect to the Marquis's son. But Bernard replied that it was foolish to expect anything else from an old provincial like him. Evan turned on his charm and introduced himself, expressing his delight at meeting him. In response to Evan's kindness, he asked to be addressed as Grandfather Bernard. Evan thanks the market owner for his work, but before leaving, he turned to young Evan again. Before leaving Evan's room, he told him that he had found several more children of demigod status. Evan was overjoyed to hear this and asked the market owner to bring all the children to him as soon as he found them. And before leaving, Evan asked the market owner to stop by his father, the Marquis's office. He told him to keep everything secret and tell his father that Evan had found himself an excellent assistant. Grandfather Bernard looked at Evan and realized that he was not like a child at all, and it seemed to him that he was hiding something. Evan said that he was indeed 9 years old, but noted that many people asked the same question about his age. Then Grandfather Bernard said that the market owner had come to him and told him that Evan possessed knowledge of alchemy that he did not know. Looking at Evan with excessive seriousness, he said that if it was a lie, he would not let it go. Evan then proposed a deal whereby Grandpa Bernard would stay with him for 5 years if Evan turned out to be right. Evan then added that Grandpa Bernard would stay with him for a certain self-evident fee. He agreed, but added to the agreement that if he failed, he would take him with him as an apprentice and force him to tell the whole truth. Evan realized that this option suited him perfectly, so he accepted all the terms of the agreement and agreed. Then they decided not to delay their business any longer and went to the Brotherhood's pharmacy. They looked at the beautiful building, and Grandfather Bernard remarked that he could even hear the Creator literally sending all the gods here. Hannah noted that she would like to work in this beautiful place, and Evan said that everything would happen just like that. Before telling Grandpa Bernard about his knowledge, Evan suggested they go to the laboratory. In this laboratory, they were able to see a new way of making potions. Evan showed them the laboratory herb cultivation that was located there. Evan was not at all surprised to see their shocked faces, because it would impress anyone. After all, it takes very little time to make this potion, and the list of herbs needed to create it is negligible. The only drawback is that the recipe for this potion is known only to those who have gone through all the circles of hell in the third part of the Battle of Demons. And then Evan, holding a bottle of potion in his hands, asked Grandpa Bernard if he knew anything about it. But as expected, Grandfather had no idea about any of this. And then Grandfather Bernard realized that he had indeed lost, and now he would have to fulfill the terms of their 5-year contract. Evan explained that the stronger the herbs, the longer they take to grow, and they need to be rotated so that they don't lose their properties. But despite all this, Evan explained that there would be an opportunity to create an entire line of potions. Bernard realized that he really knew nothing about this recipe and admitted that he had a lot to learn from young Evan. Evan said that he was also incredibly happy about this, giving Grandpa Bernard a piece of paper
and a pen. Evan, feeling joyful, asked Grandpa Bernard to sign their contract for a term of 5 or 50 years. Evan then realized that despite the limitations of his character's availability, Bernard Garcia could become part of his team. And when Evan managed to hire Bernard, he realized that this was not a game at all, but real life. Evan then realized that he had to make changes to his book, and he had to do it immediately. After what happened, Evan lost sleep and rest in the hope of finishing his book about the third part of the Battle of Demons as soon as possible. And while writing this book, he did not stop training with slugs for a second. Finally, he was able to complete a full update of the list of all the characters in the very game in which he found himself. Now all that remained was to put his brilliant plan into action. He instructed Grandpa Bernard and his assistant to gather all the medicinal herbs within the city limits. Then he said that gradually they would be able to expand the area for collecting various medicinal herbs. Evan was sure that travelers who had no idea about the properties of these herbs would thank them for saving them the trouble.
Grandfather Bernard understood that Evan was suggesting they share a sample of the potion with those who sold these herbs.
Evan agreed because he knew that there was no one who would not feel the effect of the potion created thanks to Bernard's abilities. After all, if they could create a potion that was cheaper and easier to prepare, they could create an entire commercial production. The townspeople would appreciate the product, and even travelers would benefit greatly from it, according to Evan. Evan also noted that the low price of the goods did not guarantee that their labor would pay off, although the income would not be high at first. The only problem Evan saw was possible interference from the church, but with the Marquis's orders, they would have to agree. Grandfather Bernard did not want to, but he still took Hannah as an assistant because Evan could not be there every day. But Evan understood that they would make a pretty good team as a simple man and an alchemist, especially since he definitely liked Hannah. Then Evan turned to Mabel and reminded her that it would be difficult for him and his brother to manage this business on their own. That is why he said that Mabel would be the official representative of the pharmacy and manage production instead of them. Then Evan asked her what she thought about it and whether she thought she could handle the task. But with a sparkle in her eyes, she said that she had been preparing for this moment ever since he and his brother first mentioned it, and promised that she would be able to handle it. She said she was capable of overcoming any difficulties and could easily solve any problems that arose in their place. As a result, the maid Mabel became the manager of the pharmacy, and her responsibilities included providing Evan with the ingredients for his own potion. At this stage, Evan's third plan was going smoothly, and she understood that they were on the right track to avoid their possible demise. Literally 7 days later, the opening of the pharmacy caused a real sensation among the residents. The potions flew off the shelves like hotcakes in exchange for anything the residents wanted. Everyone noted that these potions were very different from those that could be found in the dungeons among the treasures. After all, the potions created by the greatest alchemist Bernard could not be compared to any other potion. Mabel reported to Evan that they were selling potions in exchange for poisonous and medicinal herbs, as Evan had ordered. Evan said that people would be able to obtain high-quality potions, and even meetings with priests would become more effective. Many said that the potions created by Bernard were sometimes more useful than healing by a priest. And when Father Marquis was able to review the report on the activities of their pharmacy, he was surprised by the figures and thought that this was their income. Eric said that this figure was net profit, taking into account the cost of resources and employee salaries. At that moment, the Marquis was extremely proud of his young son Evan because he had managed to organize all this on his own. As interest in the newly opened pharmacy grew rapidly, Evan decided to hire 2 more pharmacists on recommendation, and the realization that all the herbs in the city would end up in their hands was quite pleasant for them. Finally, the potion created by Evan was ready, and Mabel was worried that Evan was going to drink it. Evan managed to create a poisonous tea containing equal amounts of medicinal and poisonous herbs that would help him build up his immunity. After tasting the tea, Evan noted that his recipe was probably a success because he could feel a tingling sensation in his throat. Mabel was very worried about her young master because she thought he might die if he continued to drink this tea. As Evan continued to train on the slugs, he realized that even though he had become stronger, the slugs were still making noises. When Evan's birthday arrived, he realized that his training as an aristocrat would begin very soon, and he would not be able to train as much. Regarding the sound from the slugs, Shine suggested telling everyone that it was simply a sound coming from the soles of his shoes. Bella suggested shouting every time Evan dealt with a slug, but Evan replied that shouting every second would be strange. Then Shine suggested simply telling everyone the truth, since many probably already guessed it. But Evan thought that was impossible. Evan explained that there was a big difference between the perception of what he was doing and the realization that he was killing slugs. And then he said that the best solution would be for everything to remain a secret. Shane said that Evan should deal with the slugs before they made any noise. But Evan understood that he had been trying to learn this skill all year, and so far, nothing had worked. Suddenly, Shine said that they had found a solution and that they would need to go down into the dungeon to do so. But Evan didn't let Shine finish his sentence and immediately refused. Evan explained that there were only 2 years left until the end of their agreement. By this, he meant that they would be able to go there once all their preparations were complete. Shine began to get angry because he believed that they had become much stronger than before. Evan replied that they had not even managed to reveal half of their power. Knowing all the possible ways Evan's character could die, he decided to create a special tea that would give him immunity to various substances. Then he turned to Shine and Belua, saying that in a year, they had become much stronger than they used to be. He also noted that initially, they were happy that they were able to reach the same level of strength as the others. When Evan said that they had both become proud of this, Shane flew into a rage, saying that this was not the case at all. Shane said that now he was not proud, but simply happy that no one could defeat him. Evan explained to Shine that even trained warriors often perished in the dungeon. Evan said this because he had previously met those who had managed to die on the first floor of the dungeon. Then he told young Shine that they would definitely go to the dungeon as soon as the time was right. He turned to Shane and said that his strength was growing rapidly and there was no need to rush. Then he said that they needed to prepare thoroughly for everything in order to avoid unpleasant accidents. Shane reluctantly agreed with the words of his young master, Evan Deschardin. Meanwhile, Belua turned to Shane and asked him to be a little gentler, but he was nervous because she was only 8 years old and couldn't say such things. A little later, Evan was brought the medicinal and poisonous herbs they had managed to collect over the week, as he had requested. Mabel clarified that the herbs brought to her were labeled with the letter F. She also told Evan that Grandpa Bernard needed an educated pharmacist because more people were needed for the work now. In his opinion, his assistant Hannah should become his assistant, as she had gained enough experience for this. Evan asked her about the news concerning the church. Mabel said that when another pharmacy opened, someone was still doing their dirty business, and they asked the Marquis to check it out. At that moment, Evan thought that Mabel was doing her job even better than he had expected. Mabel asked Evan what he had come up with regarding training with slugs, but he asked her to come up with ways he could get rid of the slugs' squeaks when they die. Suddenly, she had an idea that there might be an artifact that could grant the power of capture, but Evan replied that most likely, an artifact created solely for this ability simply did not exist. But suddenly this thought led him to another, and he realized that such an item did indeed exist. He remembered the existence of an artifact that could increase strength and was quite easy to control. He remembered that there was an event that was accidental in nature and occurred after the main character's meeting with Evan. After all, if the main character's birthday is added to the list of special dates, Evan will one day show him the gloves that made him stronger. And the main character would accept these gloves as a gift and put them on, but suddenly his attacks would become much weaker. And then he would be doomed to die because his skills would also weaken, and Evan himself would also die from the monster's blade. In another scenario, when Evan himself puts on the gloves in the dungeon, he finds that he is deprived of magic. In the end, both heroes die, deprived of the necessary support. All this meant only one thing. This artifact definitely increases strength when equipped correctly. But the problem is that these gloves can only be used alone. Otherwise, any power will lose its potency. And so Evan decided to try using these gloves on the slugs, since he had no other weapons. Then Evan confidently told his companions that they were going shopping immediately. And while they were on the road, he thought about buying something for Shine and Belua. When our heroes arrived at their destination, Shine and Belua were extremely surprised by what they saw. Evan told Mabel that they needed to go down the alley, but Mabel reminded him that the artifact shop was on the other side. Evan told her that only fakes were sold there, because real artifacts could not be sold in a regular shop. Shine and Belua were completely shocked to hear that Evan knew about this. Evan was sure that such items were most likely auctioned off or used privately. He also did not rule out the possibility that such items were often stolen. Evan explained to his friend Shine that this is how life is, and that some artifacts can even change someone's destiny. And for this very reason, Evan said that some people often succumb to temptation. Shane began to get nervous again because he believed that his young master was completely different and not like those people. Evan said that the reason for this was that he was born into a good family and had no reason to envy anyone. And then he said that if it weren't for that fact, he would most likely have become like most researchers. But young Shine simply refused to believe it and believed that Evan was not like that, and could never become like that. Bella joined in, agreeing with Shine and saying that regardless of class, Evan remained the same. But this was also part of Evan's plan, and he understood that they were talking this way because of their very young age. After all, because of his memories of Lee Punmin, he couldn't shout that he wasn't like all the other scoundrels. But Evan still thanked his friends for thinking of him in this way. When Mabel asked about their next destination, Evan said he had a couple of places in mind, but he wasn't sure if they were still there. Then he said that first they would go to the butcher. Mabel said that Evan was as incredibly sweet and cool as ever, but Evan himself tried to pretend he hadn't heard that. Evan said that among dungeon explorers, there are sometimes those who try to taste the lifeless body of a monster. But the important thing is that monster meat is not recommended for consumption because it contains poison. It turns out that only those who are immune to poison can try such meat. Nevertheless, some are sometimes able to secretly take such meat out of the dungeon. Evan then told everyone that there is a belief that eating such meat can make you stronger. But Evan said that these were just rumors. And Shine realized that if it were true, Evan would have let them try it long ago. But Evan also said that eating such meat could develop susceptibility to poisonous substances. Mabel immediately pounced on Evan and asked him not to do this. But Evan replied that they were not going to the butcher for that reason at all. And so they finally reached the place they needed to be, the butcher shop Evan had mentioned. When Evan knocked on the door, a man who didn't look very friendly opened it immediately. Evan replied that the man probably knew very well who was standing in front of him and suggested they not waste any time. The man noted that he had been informed that Evan and his companions were not ordinary customers. The man noted that such an important person had not come here to buy meat, and certainly not to sell it. And then the man asked why Evan and his company had come to his butcher shop. Evan said that this man had something whose importance he did not even suspect. Then he decided to ask the man what he thought about the thing Evan had just told him about. Evan said that if the man gave him the item, he would promise to clear his good name. But Evan was familiar with such characters, having met them in the third part of the Battle of Demons. Then Evan explained that it was useless to search for this item for someone who was not worthy of it. Evan turned to the man and told him that he had heard about his dream of becoming a chef. Evan reminded him of the existing exam to obtain a chef's certificate, which proves that he is capable of cooking monster meat. Evan said that by giving him the item, he could put in a good word for him, and he could start the new life he had always dreamed of. It was clear from the man's face that Evan's offer intrigued him. Finally, he exhaled and asked what young Mr. Evan wanted. It wasn't long before the item Evan needed was in their hands, and they left the shop feeling happy. And when they opened the package, they saw artifacts that could not fail to surprise. After that, Evan and his companions walked around the city and bought some purple roast. Evan realized that the artifacts existing in this reality were an excellent catch. Shine and Bellowa felt incredible magical power and warmth emanating from the artifact as they looked at it. But when they took the artifacts in their hands, they suddenly stopped feeling everything they had felt before. Vinny asked Shine and Bellowa why, in their opinion, these artifacts had not yet found their owners. Shane suggested that it was because no one knew that these were real artifacts before. Evan said he heard the correct answer and then asked why no one knew about these artifacts. Bella suggested that these artifacts did not look like artifacts at all, and that was the reason, in her opinion. Evan said that he bought these artifacts only because they had previously malfunctioned, and the methods of owning them had changed somewhat. But Shine and Bellowa did not understand the meaning of these words, but nevertheless looked at Evan with admiration. Evan realized that he had completely confused these guys, because in order to understand all this, you had to be a first-class gamer. He explained that to control the blades of the same blood, you had to touch the crimson sphere in Bellowa's hands. After that, he explained that after waiting for the jade glow, one must touch the bloodline itself. Evan knew that due to an error in the game's creation, the settings for these two artifacts had been mixed up. But as Yeban Min, he didn't know this and relied on guides, gathering information and completing quests in order to obtain them. And Evan bought them because they were the best artifacts in all of Chardon. Evan told them to touch the artifacts one at a time, saying that they would both gain power if Evan was right. They did as Evan told them, and an incredible miracle happened. The artifacts really worked. Evan watched his companions and their reaction to what was happening. Evan looked at them and was amazed that this bug was still present in the game. He understood that everything that was given according to the recipe of the fourth part of the demon battle was strikingly different in quality from the summoning of slugs and other items. And he didn't understand at all how to evaluate this world, because he had understood this from the moment the slash attack was cancelled, because it was strange. Realizing that the world he had found himself in earlier was his favorite game, he tried in every way not to think about it anymore. But he couldn't help wondering if this world was really real. Now, looking at what was happening, Evan understood that the plot had clearly taken a completely new turn. Evan looked at them and realized that as soon as he looked at these children, it became clear that everything was going according to plan. Balua and Shine immediately began to thank Evan for his help and involvement in developing their powers. And now that they had dealt with those artifacts, Evan decided it was time for him to start too. He thought about how he had managed to become stronger thanks to his pendant, and that it was time to use the gloves and prevent death. He decided to take the first step into the unknown. Suddenly, when he put on the gloves, he saw that their color had changed, and he could clearly see it when he put them on. This artifact was designed to raise the player's strength to a certain level. This artifact rather increased the power of the player's entire physical strength. It didn't take long for everything Evan had planned to work out perfectly. Evan finally managed to get rid of the slime before it made a sound, and now he could calmly continue his training. Suddenly, Evan felt something very strange happening to his pendant. He realized that it was definitely an increase in the level of the pendant. He tried to defeat the slime again, heard a sound, and realized that he was back to where he had been before. Mabel, passing by Evan's room, heard his ferocious cry of frustration at his failure. He sat there and thought that perhaps fate itself was laughing at him and his attempts to fix the situation with artifacts. And then Evan realized that he didn't need an artifact at all, but a new skill, and thought that he probably had no choice. Then he called Mabel, who was happy to hear this. He asked her to make him some tea and add poison to it. Mabel was not very happy to hear this, but she accepted the order and went to carry it out. And when Mabel brought Evan the tea, he thought that in order to master this skill, he needed to fulfill certain conditions. Fortunately for him, one of the conditions had already been fulfilled, and he just had to continue training to develop immunity. Then he decided to try training in the devilish attack. This attack is designed for an opponent who is on the verge of death, resulting in the opponent dying from a single blow. At first glance, it may seem that this attack is only used at the end of a battle, but in fact, there are several interesting points. This attack can be used on opponents with full health, but mastering this skill is not easy. This skill cannot be used to silence slugs, but Evan had a secret plan for that. Evan's problem now was to fulfill the fourth condition, where the enemy must not know about the upcoming attack. To do this, Evan needed to deal with the slime immediately after summoning it. And the last condition is that the player must be affected by a negative impact on the player's game characteristics. But if Evan was off-screen, all he had to do was press a couple of key combinations. But now, this could be difficult. And now, the only question was whether Evan's body could handle this attack. He knew he had to do everything possible. Literally a couple of days later, Grandpa Bernard was asked to prepare a potion that would help relieve muscle pain. Mabel breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that their pharmacy really did have everything. This potion was necessary for Evan, but Bernard did not understand where the child's muscle pain could have come from. And then Bernard thought that the boy was working tirelessly. Mabel thought that everyone in the castle had heard Evan's cries, but since they thought he was busy with something important, they stopped paying attention to it. It wasn't long before Evan's whole family was knocking on his door, worried about it. His father yelled, demanding that Evan open his door immediately. A couple of days later, Mabel came to Evan's room with medicine in her hands. She tried to treat his knee, assuming it was a lunge, and Evan agreed. The thing is, when you try to use a devilish attack on your opponent, you have to cancel it and activate a decisive blow. And in order to determine which attack would come first, Evan decided that the best solution was to use a lunge. After all, he couldn't carry out an attack that required both hands, as they were currently dealing with the slugs. In addition, he needed to predict the right time to kill the slime, and he told Mabel that it would be hard work. And that is why Evan is constantly in such a tense and nervous state. After all, it was incredibly difficult for him to repeat all these movements himself, because before that, everything was done by clicking the necessary keys. Mabel, having no idea what he was talking about, simply wished him luck. After these words, Evan promised Mabel that he would definitely give it his all, and Mabel said she would watch his progress. But Evan told her to go and continue her work, even though Mabel wanted to skip out on work. Meanwhile, the people standing outside the door asked Evan to open the door to his room so they could catch a glimpse of him. Evan knew he didn't have much time and needed to master the skill before his 10th birthday. He also understood that if he didn't do it, he would die, just like all the other times he had been in the game. Meanwhile, Shine was worried about his young master's health, because at this rate, it could seriously affect his condition. Bella reassured Shine, saying that there was absolutely no reason to worry about this. Bella explained that if Evan needed to do this, he would definitely be able to handle it. Suddenly, Mabel appeared at Evan's door, bringing him a potion to help relieve his muscle pain. Suddenly, she realized that she could no longer hear Evan's screams and moans coming from the room. Then a large crowd gathered outside the door, including his parents, who were trying to get through to him. The Marquis demanded the key from Mabel, but she replied that Evan was deliberately propping the door open from the inside with something. At that moment, Evan's mother thought about something, as if a certain thought had occurred to her. She said that Evan had probably forgotten that it was his birthday today, and at that moment, Evan opened the door. To reassure everyone, he said that he was perfectly fine. Suddenly, Evan asked his father for permission to take another artifact from the warehouse. He asked for it as a gift and reward for his success in the pharmacy business. It wasn't long before Evan's training began, and his math teacher praised him for absorbing knowledge like a sponge. Despite all of Yebanmin's knowledge, mathematics was extremely difficult for Evan. He found it strange that all the science fiction he read was about an incredibly talented hero who amazed everyone with his talent. And when Evan read about this, he became upset, realizing that he was completely unlike this hero. He had to learn many things that were unknown to him, and another part had to be learned by him as an aristocrat. And he understood perfectly well that in order to continue his studies, he would have to go out into society where there was a risk of his imminent death. And in order to avoid death because of his handsome face, he even thought about disfiguring his face with a weapon, but Mabel replied that his face was beautiful. The artifact that Evan asked his father for was earrings, and Shine asked if they were enough for him. Shine found it strange that his father allowed him to take anything he wanted, but Evan took only the earrings that were already on his ears. Evan replied that he wanted these earrings more than anything else, and that being born into this family was enough for him. It turned out that these earrings were an artifact of the spirit of the White Mountains, capable of increasing the speed of mana regeneration. After Evan received them, his training time increased significantly. Shane noted that since Evan had turned 10, he could now use weapons for training. Evan said that he did not need weapons at the moment, and that he could not yet remove the artifact gloves. He explained that in order to understand what would be more effective, he decided to take up hand-to-hand combat training. He understood that in the future, he would definitely find a weapon that suited him, but for now, hand-to-hand combat would be more than enough. Evan had a hunch that his character might be good at using unusual weapons, and he figured he could figure it out by trying different ones. Evan had 2 whole years left to find out. He thought about what might happen if he couldn't find a suitable weapon, and realized that not everyone was destined to be the main character. Not long after, the captain of the Marquisate of Chardon's night squad, Michael de Erlock, was conducting training. Suddenly, Evan appeared on the training ground and greeted Michael de Erlock cordially. Captain Erlock of the Nightly Defense Squad was responsible for the safety of the Marquis and his family, and was considered the most reliable person among his subjects. Evan suddenly caught himself thinking that when he played this game, he did not notice Erlock's frightening aura at all. In the game, he bravely fell defending the Marquis' family during the invasion of the 4 warriors of the Demon King. Unfortunately for Evan, he was also destined to die in this battle, but he had time to prepare for this event. Suddenly, Evan told Captain Erlock about his desire to learn hand-to-hand combat. He was happy to train Evan personally, because none of the young guys wanted to voluntarily master the art of hand-to-hand combat. Evan, in turn, did not expect such a reaction from his future mentor in this martial art. Erlock himself promised Evan that he would be the best teacher in the world for him, asking him not to worry about it at all. Although they started training with what Erlock considered to be the simplest techniques, our heroes quickly lost their strength due to the strain. And now, Evan and Shane have been training in hand-to-hand combat for a month, and Evan realized that his body was stronger than he thought. Suddenly, Belua approached and offered her help, intending to wipe the sweat from Evan's face. She also brought him some chilled honey lemon tea with ice, which helps relax the muscles. Suddenly, Shine asked Belua for the same drink she had offered and brought only for Evan. She looked at Shine and noticed that there was not a single drop of sweat on his face. Suddenly, the hand-to-hand combat instructor approached them and told Evan that he would be absent from tomorrow's training for a while. The captain of the knights said he had received orders to clear the dungeon, and Evan was surprised that the captain himself was going there. This was extremely surprising to Evan, because Michael had never gone down into the dungeon before. Michael himself said that watching these guys grow had inspired him to improve himself. He said that he still wanted to become stronger, despite his age, and Evan replied that it was definitely a great idea. Evan said that by becoming stronger, Michael would be able to better protect the Marquis' family, and teach Evan and Shane many things. Then Michael asked Evan for his opinion on the divine blessing given when clearing dungeons. Suddenly, Evan stood up and said that all of this was a sign from above. Evan said that God, being of sound mind, would not give blessings left and right. After all, blessings can only be obtained for progress made in the dungeon. And that is why Evan explained that Michael was doing everything absolutely right and was on the right path.
Michael was shocked that such thoughts about the way of development did not cause feelings of oppression in young Evan. But Evan replied that everything in life requires effort. By this, he meant endless battles with monsters and avoiding death in attempts to find the right path. Then Evan said that making an effort was a reward for his successes. He explained that each of them trains to become stronger, and as a reward, their overall level increases. That is why Evan said that God himself judges them for their actions and blesses them, and therefore he considers it fair. Evan said that he considers Michael's double training and his trip to the dungeon to be equivalent. At the same time, he told him that going to the dungeon would yield very good results. Michael found Evan's words very encouraging and therefore began to treat them completely differently. Then he bowed to Evan and said that he would return soon and would definitely thank him. Then he told Evan that upon his return, he would definitely teach his young students his best techniques and become the best teacher for them. And before everyone went to the dungeon, Shine said that they couldn't sit idly by, intending to train with them. 4 days after the captain went to the dungeon, Evan also talked to the owner of the slave market. He then told Evan that he had brought him 2 more children he had told him about earlier. The boy with brown eyes, who was the same young age as Evan, introduced himself as Paul. The second girl also timidly introduced herself as Maria. Looking at them, Evan realized that they did not quite resemble demigods, as they were too thin for that. And then Evan realized that most likely they had completely different names in the game. But Evan also understood that characters with such cute faces couldn't be ordinary extras, because the more beautiful a character is, the more important they are. Of course, Evan himself was an exception in this regard. And then, without further ado or discussion, Evan asked Mabel to take the children away to clean them up and wash them. Mabel was happy to realize that Evan had managed to assemble a real team to protect him, but Evan did not think so. Evan had a plan to make sure these children would always remember what he had done for them in their childhood. It was interesting that Evan had initially sought them out for his own protection, but in the end, he was able to change the fate of each of them. Then the owner of the slave market provided Evan with the report he had requested. At that point, the market owner had been unable to find some of the people due to a lack of leads. It turned out that Evan had requested information about the most important characters, but he realized that it would not be so easy to find. The market owner apologized for the lack of results, but Evan said it was no big deal and asked him not to forget about his request. Evan understood that difficulties could arise from the fact that these characters were not yet active, and, moreover, the name and past of the main character were unknown. He understood that it would be difficult to find a character based on appearance, since the player gives the character a name, and these changes appeared in the third part of the game. And then, Evan decided to continue his work on this, and promised himself to make every effort possible. Suddenly, Shine asked Evan if he was going to go to the front line himself, and Evan was very surprised by this question. Evan replied that he had no reason to be there, as he was a secondary character. He said that it would be better for him to watch from the sideline, helping with artifacts, in order to save his life. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by Belua, who came and informed Evan that it was time for his classes, which he needed to attend. Meanwhile, people on the street were dying from the scorching sun and, as a result, from the heat. Grandpa Bernard also couldn't help but notice the high air temperature, which was simply unbearable. Bernard complained to Evan that their uniforms were too warm for summer, pointing to his assistant Hannah. Evan understood that Grandpa Bernard simply wanted to see his assistant in lighter clothing. Evan then pointed out Bernard's attentiveness, to which Bernard replied that Evan had not considered the change of season. Bernard shouted that he was the best alchemist in town and that he could feel the slightest temperature changes very clearly. But Evan didn't believe Bernard at all and understood what he was after. Suddenly, Hannah arrived with a special cooling dessert that helps people survive the hot Korean summer. Evan realized that now was the best time to ask Hannah about her dress. Hannah replied that even though the dress was made of expensive fabric, it was still hot. Evan apologized for not noticing this right away and promised to have a summer uniform made for her as soon as he returned home. He also asked Hannah to contact Mabel if she had any questions or needed anything. Meanwhile, Grandpa Bernard smiled slyly, as if Evan was partly right about his plans. Suddenly, Bernard told Evan that he was grateful to him for taking care of their pharmacy and felt he owed him something in return. Bernard noticed that Evan had problems with strength because he had sufficient knowledge, but skills and mana did not come easily to him. Bernard said that thanks to him, Evan would learn to control his balance. Bernard told Evan to come to him every day for at least an hour to learn alchemy and to bring materials with him. This was a great joy for Evan,
as alchemy skills greatly influenced development in the third part of the demon battle. That same evening, an unknown person noted that there had been relatively few offerings today. The maid turned to her bishop and reminded him of the Brotherhood's recently opened pharmacy. After these words, he struck his fist in anger at the fact that because of this pharmacy, the church's offerings had sharply decreased. He believed that the creators of the pharmacy had dared to go against God's will with their methods, which he considered vicious. Meanwhile, Grandpa Bernard was trying a dessert called binsu. A short time later, Hannah came to Evan and asked if he had finished his lessons. After an hour of classes with Bernard, Evan, completely exhausted, noted that if this continued, it could take about 50 years. Ivan looked out the window and realized that it was already very late, and he needed to go back because he still had a lot to do. As soon as he realized this, he immediately left the pharmacy where Hannah and Bernard were. Bernard noted that Evan was a quick learner and would need about 5 years to master this skill. Grandpa Bernard enjoyed teaching the talented child and even felt a touch of pride. Hannah said that since there were fewer customers, she could help them learn how to brew potions. Hannah explained that the church had organized a free blessing campaign, which is why there were noticeably fewer customers in their pharmacy. In reality, it was a cunning plan by the bishop of that very church. He believes that this would bring everything back to normal, as he considered the potions to be nothing compared to a blessing. His assistant said that this was only a temporary effect and that the free blessing campaign was still in effect, and she thought it was a bad idea because they would become enemies. But he didn't even want to hear about it because the number of offerings to the church continued to decline with the appearance of the Brotherhood's pharmacy. He considered the people under the Marquis's command to be despicable because, in his opinion, they were luring researchers and townspeople away. She tried to make him understand that they would have to deal with the Marquis here, and that all this could escalate into a conflict with the people. And when a sly smile spread across the bishop's face, he noted that he only needed to avoid conflict with the Marquis's family. The assistant tried to explain to the bishop that the pharmacy workers were completely innocent residents, and that he should not do anything to them. The bishop explained that he had no intention of taking their lives, while seemingly having a completely different plan in mind. Out of desperation, the girl came to the bar and cried out that she couldn't take it anymore. She thought the excuse about power was absurd, because she understood that the bishop wanted to take the money for himself. She understood that, despite all this, they were performing these blessings completely free of charge. Suddenly, she asked the bar owner to prepare another portion of food for her, but she was refused because they had run out of food. She shouted that this couldn't be, but she was told that the rest of the food had already been ordered. Suddenly, Evan appeared behind her and noted that the priestess Servina Belaine was very fond of meat on a skewer. Then Evan said that if she didn't mind, he would like to treat her. When the priestess Servina Belaine heard her name, she turned toward Evan. All the guests in the bar also glanced at them when they heard the familiar name. The priestess did not refuse Evan's offer and, devouring the meat, thought about her enemy, noting his incredible greed. Evan watched her and noticed that the priestess's sister became more daring after she drank. Evan realized that she visited this place regularly. It turns out that in the fourth part of the Battle of the Demons, Servina Belaine will appear as the Great Bishop. But this event will only happen in 15 years, and now she is about 18 years old. She drank and thought about giving up everything and asking to join the Marquis's family as a priest. Evan's eyes lit up immediately, and he realized that he was incredibly lucky to meet a priestess here again. Without hesitation, Evan offered her the position of priest under his leadership. Evan promised to provide her with inexhaustible support if she agreed. But after finishing her drink, she declined, with regret in her eyes, saying that she simply could not do it. The reason for her refusal was the promise she had made to herself to make the church a better place. Evan turned to her like a little sister and said that she didn't have the power to change anything right now. Continuing to drink, she agreed and said that she was annoying her bishop, but really couldn't change anything. Evan thought about it and remembered that she appeared in the fourth part as the bishop of the main body of the Order of the Great, and it was not in the city of Chardon's dungeons at all, but in a completely different place. Ultimately, the main building would suffer a serious blow and be destroyed at the very beginning of the fourth part. And then Evan wondered about the reasons for her being here, because before she was sent to the main building, she had always been here. Evan understood that he could not let the plot repeat itself, and that he had to change her fate for the better. Then Evan lowered his eyes and turned to his sister, the priestess, again. He said that if she didn't have the power to change anything, she could rely on someone stronger. She looked at him as if she didn't understand what he meant. Evan reminded her of anonymity, which helps keep all personal data from prying eyes. Then he addressed her as if he did not know her name and suggested continuing the conversation anonymously. He asked her to describe the problem and offered to discuss ways to solve it. Later, Grandpa Bernard again held classes with Evan to improve his alchemy skills. Evan looked at him and promised not to forget a single word Bernard said. Then Evan gathered his subjects and announced that they might be facing an ambush. Evan promised not to let his subjects be harmed because he was the one who had invited them to this city and was responsible for their safety. He ordered Dane to ensure the safety of all the workers at the Brotherhood's pharmacy. Dane said that any attack on any of them would be considered an attack on the market itself. Hannah, standing in the crowd, asked who could be capable of such a thing, and Evan replied that it was quite simple. Evan explained that the Order of the Mad Bishop was trying to prevent their Brotherhood pharmacy from doing business. And then everyone realized that the free promotion was only intended to undermine the pharmacy's reputation. Evan said that their campaign did not bother him at all, because the church probably had many reasons for such an action. Then Bernard said that everyone needed to start making potions. They decided to make potions and distribute them in poor areas of the city to those who could not afford them. Bernard said he would personally check each potion for correctness and safety. This was their plan to counter the church and its free blessing campaign. Bernard said that this plan was devised not only to counter the church, but simply so that the remaining ingredients would not go to waste. But Evan pointed out a new problem. While they were all outside the pharmacy, the church had an excellent opportunity to ambush them. Evan then suggested preparing everything in advance so that the church would not be able to deny anything. Then he showed everyone the information he had obtained from anonymous sources. There was information about the Knights of the Order who were planning to participate in the ambush, and Evan suggested watching them and capturing them alive. Evan gave Dane these lists and asked him to show them to the soldiers so they could familiarize themselves with them. And when Evan explained all the information, he suggested not wasting any time and starting to carry out their plan. And so, when they had prepared a batch of potions, they went to the slums of the city and began distributing the potions to those in need. The poor people were very happy and simply cried with joy. Evan looked at the amount of potion they had prepared and realized that it would be enough to provide for all the residents of the slums. Everyone thanked Evan profusely for his kindness because many of them really needed this potion. Evan understood that he did all this not for the sake of the people, but for his own well-being, in order to save his life in the future. Dane turned to Evan and noted that he was doing everything for the people, and everyone who understood this would surely love him. Evan replied that he hoped to continue in the same vein. Suddenly, Dane received the message through the magical artifact in his ear that the pharmacy had been attacked. Dane was told that they had managed to detain the person who had broken into the pharmacy, and that it was probably competitors from another shop. Dane told his young master that the church had probably already begun to carry out its insidious plans. As Dane and Evan headed there, Evan realized something was definitely wrong and told Dane so. And then, after Evan's words, Dane immediately drew his weapon, preparing to fight. Suddenly, an unknown voice said that he was impressed because they had noticed him. Dane told Evan that he couldn't see his opponent and asked him to be careful. Suddenly, they were able to see him, and it was a thief in the shadows, a phantom. This character appears at the beginning of the game, and his cloak artifact helps him when attacking. Dane addressed his opponent and warned him what could happen to him if he attacked the Marquis's second son. But the enemy was completely uninterested, and it was written all over his face. He said he was just doing his job and getting rid of anyone who gave out free potions. Evan explained to Dane that the bishop sends someone like him when he really wants to get rid of someone. Evan said he had anticipated this outcome and had therefore warned all the workers. Evan realized that he had never been so kind in his life, and his conscience began to bother him when he heard people's gratitude. The enemy looked at Evan and couldn't understand how he knew who he was. And he couldn't understand how Evan could see him since he was hidden under a cloak, which was extremely strange. Dane said he could handle him on his own, and moreover, he had already called for backup. Dane said that it would not be easy to fight because he could not see the enemy, but he promised to fight to the last until help arrived. Evan understood that Dane's courage was commendable, but he couldn't let him die in this battle. So Evan asked Dane to close his eyes, and Dane was extremely surprised because he didn't understand what that could mean. Then Evan smashed something on the floor with a swing, and the jar shattered into tiny pieces. After that, a bright, blinding light appeared around them, from which even the enemy could not hide. And when the enemy was on the floor, having thrown off his cloak, Evan ordered Dane to act. Without hesitation, Dane quickly dealt with the enemy, not giving him a chance to explain. It turned out that the enemy had not come alone, and another scoundrel began to attack Evan from behind. But Evan couldn't stand idly by, and immediately thrust his fist straight into the enemy's chest. Evan noted that the enemy looked much stronger than he actually was, since he was knocked down by a single blow from a child. Evan was curious to see what would happen to those who attacked him when the Marquis found out. Later, after numerous interrogations, the Marquis was finally informed that the scoundrels insisted that they simply wanted to make money and did not know who Evan was. The butler also reported that Bishop Cedron had done a clean job, as it was impossible to prove his involvement in what had happened. The other attackers only said that they acted out of resentment over the reduction in donations and not on the bishop's orders. All the attackers unanimously claimed that they did not know that the young gentleman would be at the scene of the attack. The Marquis was furious because he understood that their family was most likely simply being underestimated. The butler suggested that if they sent an official complaint to the church, such an incident would be unlikely to happen again. But the Marquis disagreed with the butler's suggestion and believed that this would certainly not be the case. He could not allow this because his dear and beloved son had almost been harmed. The Marquis said that this would never have happened if the church had taken them into account. And then he realized that it was time to show the power of their family. He was determined to show the true power of the Chardin family so that they would remember it once and for all. The butler said that Evan had found the perfect weapon to fight back against the Order of the Great. After hearing this, the Marquis realized that he needed to talk to his son. Later, Evan explained that in just 4 days, they would be able to get even with the bishop. The Marquis said that the butler had told him that it was all somehow connected with a representative of the church. Evan agreed and told his father that he had managed to prepare for the attack in advance thanks to this. He said that the church would help them deal with the bishop if they could be patient. Evan told his father that the bishop was pocketing the money brought by the townspeople and that it was a huge amount. Evan also explained that this money was supposed to go to the main building, but was going somewhere else entirely. He asked his father to imagine what would happen if the main building found out about the bishop's actions. The Marquis replied without hesitation that they would certainly want to take his life, and Evan added that it was at that moment that they would make their proposal. Evan suggested promising that the Marquis would sort everything out himself, and then the reputation of the church and the order would not suffer. The Marquis understood that in this case, they would not only be able to restore relations, but also gain support. Evan managed to convince the Marquis that they would be obliged to accept their proposal in order to avoid making enemies of them. In this way, they would be able to get rid of the bishop and restore the good name of the order, thus achieving their desired outcome. The Marquis suggested that the person who provided Evan with all the information might be a liar. But Evan replied that this was out of the question. Evan replied that he had spoken to her personally and could say with 100% certainty that she was not lying. The Marquis trusted his son and asked him to rest while he waited for the report. Then he turned to Mabel and Belua and asked them to take care of his son. Both Mabel and Belua accepted the Marquis's order and promised to take good care of young Evan. Although Evan said he did not need any care, the young assistants did not stop looking after him. 3 days later, the priestess brought Evan all the information he had requested. Evan looked at the information provided and noted that with such evidence, they could easily destroy the bishop. The priestess shared her thoughts with Evan while gathering information, comforting herself with the idea that one day she would get her revenge. Evan understood that by sending this information to headquarters, they would be able to destroy the bishop's reputation and no longer have to worry about him. At that moment, the priestess seemed to feel uneasy and tense. She did not want to take the bishop's life, but simply wanted to destroy his reputation. Evan explains that, thanks to her, the pharmacy workers were still alive, and that this man deserved to die for his actions. The priestess looked at Evan and found him to be a very scary and judicious young man. The bishop is sure that the Marquis won't touch him because there's no proof he's guilty, but he's definitely wrong. The Marquis is considered one of the strongest characters in the third part of the game, and there is a moment in the plot when the Marquis personally deals with them. Evan told the priestess that she shouldn't blame herself or feel sorry for him because he was entirely to blame. After that, the priestess noted that Evan is definitely not as smart as his age would suggest. Evan said that he had already been told this, and the priestess thought that all aristocrats were like that. Evan smiled and told the priestess that he was taught not to give up even in the face of death. Evan understood that fear of death could become a major obstacle for him, preventing him from moving forward. The priestess added that allowing fear to take over could deprive one of the opportunity to develop. Hearing Evan's reasoning on many issues, she dreamed of learning to think like him. Evan reminded the priestess that he had promised her his full support, and the priestess reminded him of her refusal to work for the Marquis's family. He said he would help her, even though she was still part of the church and the order. It wasn't long before Bishop Cedron was arrested and shouted that he was innocent and that it was all just slander. But the Marquis would not listen. and showed him the order sent by the main body regarding his future fate. And when the bishop heard the order for his execution, he shouted that the order could not make such a decision. The Marquis shouted that the same would happen to anyone who dared to harm his family. Then he addressed all the townspeople and those in power, saying that everyone must conscientiously fulfill their obligations. Later, Evan told his comrades that this should calm everyone down, and that from that day on, the pharmacy's work would improve. Evan explained that a new bishop had already been appointed and was discussing with the Marquis how he could help. Shane told Evan that the former bishop's secretary had been appointed as the new bishop. Finally, Servina Belaine had fulfilled her dream and finally become bishop of the church. And now everything would definitely be different. The servants were discussing Evan and the fact that he had many times more responsibilities than his brother Eric. The Brotherhood's pharmacy had achieved great success, and everyone had previously thought that this was Eric's achievement. But that was only the official version, and everyone understood that the young Evan Deschardin was behind the success of the Brotherhood's pharmacy. Even the cooks discussed this topic, because it was extremely interesting and important. Evan suddenly began to worry again, and felt that everything was not going according to plan. He began pacing back and forth, and Mabel noted that she had seen her young master in a similar state before. He was worried that he was a secondary character, and that there was no way he could replace his brother as the main character. Mabel looked at Evan and wondered why her young master was so extremely worried. She looked at him and thought about how he always thought through his plans logically, which was completely out of character for his age. But she was confused about this because, in her opinion, Evan continued to consider himself useless, despite all this. Suddenly, she turned to Evan and told him that she thought he was very remarkable. But Evan turned around at that moment and looked at Mabel as if he had not expected to hear that at all. Mabel tried to explain to him that people expect a lot from him because he always lives up to their expectations, and so she asked him not to worry. Then, as she was leaving, she said that if he didn't want to become the head of the family, she wouldn't want that either. She said that he didn't have to become the next Marquis, just because he was special. Evan winked at her in response to these remarks, noting her kindness towards him. He looked at his hands and realized that he should have told them when he turned 12, but he probably needed to do it now. He planned to announce that he did not intend to become the next Marquis, and would instead become the successor to the captain of the knightly order. Meanwhile, Evan taught the basics of aristocratic education to the new bishop of the church. Evan asked Mabel if she knew what an aristocrat who became the head of the city was obliged to do. She began to list that he must take responsibility for everything that happens and go down into the dungeon to fight monsters. Evan also added that when two sons are born into a family, the eldest has the right to choose which path to take. That is why Evan said he plans to become the captain of the knight squad in the dungeons. By becoming a knight, he could obtain permission and enlist the support of the marquisate to create his own squad. However, Evan failed to complete this mission in the game, and Eric had to go down into the dungeon. The owner of the slave market promised Evan to find 3 more demigods, giving him 7 potential warriors for his squad. Evan then decided to go to his father and immediately tell him about his plans. Suddenly, Evan noticed that Mabel had come alone and asked about Shine and Belua and why they were not with her. Mabel said that Shane had recovered and was now at training. Mabel said that Shine was loved by the knights despite his weakness because he was a quick learner. Bella was missing again, and Mabel thought she was training again. Mabel thought that Belua was trying to take her place, so she asked Evan to talk to her so that Belua wouldn't be offended. Evan didn't quite understand what he was supposed to say to Belua, and Mabel said that he should explain that only Mabel works exclusively for him. Mabel also asked Evan to take her into his squad, and Evan replied that Mabel was the official representative of the Brotherhood's pharmacy. Suddenly, Evan saw the maids rushing somewhere. When Evan asked what had happened, the maids told him some wonderful news. They told Evan that the young lady had given birth to a beautiful baby girl who was now Evan's sister. Evan was upset to hear this because he had no idea. He understood that this was most likely because he had not paid enough attention to his family over the past year. And if he had known about it in advance, he would not have been so upset now. Evan understood that the question of inheritance had been forgotten for now, because all attention would be focused on little Miriam Deschardin. It was strange for Evan to realize that he was disappointed, even though everything was going according to plan. Mabel understood him perfectly, because her dreams had also collapsed in an instant when she dreamed of becoming the only personal maid. Mabel tried to figure out why Evan was still worried. Evan couldn't remember from the game's plot that the Marquis had a daughter. He realized that the Marquis also had many game endings, and the storyline with his daughter was one of them. He tried to remember at least one moment in the game where the Marquis's daughter appeared. He thought that she might have left her father's house after getting married, but at the same time, he realized that this was nonsense. Then 2 more assumptions about this came to Evan's mind. He realized that thanks to his actions, he was able to influence the Marquis's fate, and now Everything was going against the script. There could also be another option, and the Marquis's daughter was still in the game. But it could also be that by the time the main plot of the game began, she had died. Mabel looked at Evan and told him that no matter how cute the baby would be, he would always be number one for her. The girl was indeed a very wonderful baby named Elizabeth, who was always smiling. Eric, Evan, and the Marquis looked at her and were touched because Lizzie was incredibly wonderful. Now Evan understood that the Marquis's first wife had given him an heir and a younger son, but his second wife had been unable to bear him a child until today. For some reason, Evan felt guilty when he looked at her. When Evan's memories returned, he realized that he had not paid enough attention to this character, and that was definitely a mistake because she was the villain who had secretly taken Evan's life. He noticed that now she did not look evil, but rather happy as she looked at her child. And then Evan thought that he could prevent a future in which she might become a villain. What happened in the game's storyline and what is happening now are as different as can be. Evan wondered if the Marquis's second wife, Miriam de Chardin, had not been a villain from the beginning. Evan tried to understand what made her become that way and thought that it could have been an accident. Evan understood that security within the marquisate was top-notch, which meant it could be an incurable disease or a curse. Evan began to ask his grandfather Bernard for information on this matter, and Bernard noted Evan's endless concern for his sister. It was important for Evan to know about all possible illnesses that could affect Elizabeth. Bernard understood that Evan was the only one who could understand who he was at first glance, and thought that Evan was able to see what others could not. In response to Evan's question, Bernard said to look for the cause outside the marquisate and focus his attention there. But Bernard said he had an idea that would allow them to save not only Elizabeth's sister, but other people as well. The first task was to find traces of monsters in the city. So far, they had learned that a reverse energy flow had recently escaped from the underground, but fortunately, it had been contained. Suddenly, Evan told Grandpa Bernard that he had found something. Evan had discovered orc excrement on the wall, and this was definitely a clue. Dane suggested that it had mixed with the city dirt during the restoration work. Bernard said that perhaps no one had noticed because of the similarity in color and the lack of time. Bernard said that the traces left by monsters are a serious problem because they spread disease. This disease from the dungeon affects the entire body because humans are not accustomed to the living conditions of monsters. Bernard said that such diseases spread beyond the dungeons. He said that collecting items from the dungeon would help create conditions similar to those in the dungeon. Outbreaks of this disease outside the dungeon are much weaker and quickly fade away. But if an immature child falls ill, the consequences will be completely different. Bernard said that this disease is not fatal, but nevertheless, no cure has yet been found for it. It is also important to note that once the dungeon disease has developed in the body, the patient will die. And now that they have managed to curb the reverse flow of energy, they need to find the source of the disease. Bernard said that this is not an easy task, and that they need to find the source before the disease spreads. Evan ordered Dane to urgently inform his father about everything, and to limit the newborn's contact with the outside world to avoid the disease. Suddenly, the bishop of the church called out to Evan, and he turned toward her. When Bernard saw her, he immediately began to ask Evan about her, and he replied that her name was Servina and that she was a good friend of his. She told Evan that the number of people feeling unwell had increased significantly, and the priests couldn't cope. Evan and Bernard thought it was an infectious disease, and Evan asked to be taken to the sick. And so they all came to the place where all the sick people were lying in beds. Bernard examined the patients and said that the disease had mutated, but they would be able to create a cure. A little later, Evan gathered all the pharmacists from their Brotherhood's pharmacy and explained to them what was happening. Bernard added that even divine power was useless against this disease. Bernard told everyone that he knew a way to defeat this disease. He said that during his travels abroad, the method had not changed much, but he had studied it in great detail. As expected of Bernard Garcia, he was able to find the source of the disease, which would help contain its spread. From that time on, the pharmacy and the church were busy with the task, and thanks to this, they soon managed to obtain the medicine. With the help of the Marquis, they managed to isolate the sick and disinfect the infected areas. Bernard said that they managed to avoid disaster thanks to the joint efforts of the pharmacy and the priests, but some losses could not be avoided. He turned to Evan and asked him to think about how many people he had managed to save from certain death. Soon, Mabel came running and addressed her young master, Evan. Mabel ran to him to tell him about little Lizzie's condition. The baby had fallen ill, and Evan did not understand why the medicine had not helped her. Evan understood that the baby was not yet a month old, and therefore could not wait for the medicine to take effect. Miriam cried and didn't know what to do because she thought her little daughter wouldn't make it. Suddenly, Evan shouted that there was still time and that they had to save little Elizabeth. Bernard began to think about how to create a potion that could increase human strength by 1 level. Bernard thought about it
and told Evan that they didn't have the necessary ingredients. Evan understood that this potion would most likely help them. Suddenly, Evan realized that Lizzie was currently only at the first level, and then he couldn't think of anything better than to put his artifact gloves on her hands. He understood that this should work because points are awarded to the one who delivers the final blow. So he put one glove on her and tried to finish off the slime with one blow from his other hand. He decided to finish off the slug with Elizabeth's little hand so that she would win, and so she squeezed her little hand and a squeak was heard, which meant that the slug had gone to the other world. Everyone realized that this was the sound they had been hearing constantly after the Marquis gave him the pendant. And literally a second later, little Elizabeth began to feel better, and Evan's plan worked again. Evan was very worried about his sister and asked her to be patient a little longer and she would definitely feel better. And after a few more attempts to defeat the slugs, Elizabeth was getting better and better. Miriam couldn't hold back her tears of happiness and relief that Evan had managed to save her little daughter after all. And when the girl was saved, the Marquis ordered that a priest and a doctor be called immediately. Bernard also praised Evan's efforts, saying that it was an excellent decision, even though it was a little strange. Mabel also couldn't hold back her emotions and threw herself into Evan's arms. In the original story, this disease was called Welfen, and when it appeared, it took many lives. Evan tried to imagine how many people might have died if Bernard and the Brotherhood's pharmacy had not been there, and he realized that he would hardly have been able to cope on his own. Bernard then turned to Evan and told him that he was thinking too much. He told Evan that he didn't know his own potential and how much he knew, but he repeated himself and told Evan to remember those he had been able to save and suggested that he use his knowledge and do everything possible. He said that he could always turn to Bernard with questions or for advice, and if the problem had no solution, then he should just leave it alone. He said that by letting go of the problem, someone would surely come along who could save the day. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's older brother was upset that his little sister didn't want to be carried, but Evan noted that Lizzie probably liked Evan more than her brother Eric. But then Eric, without thinking twice, rushed over to hug them both. The Marquis called Evan over and began to talk about how he had saved not only Lizzie, but also many of the townspeople. The Marquis was curious as to why Evan refused universal recognition. Then the Marquis suggested that it was all because of his brother Eric. Evan then turned to his father and said he was ready to tell him something very important. He then confessed that he wanted to become the captain of the nightly squad of the dungeons. This came as a complete surprise to the Marquis, and for a moment, he was simply speechless. Later, Evan met with Bernard and asked him why he hadn't even asked Evan about the pendant. Bernard said that he understood everything without asking any questions and explained that once he had achieved the same strength as him, he would not need to fight slugs. Evan's older brother Eric trains as hard as Evan, although he tries to hide it in every way possible. Evan then doubted that the Marquis himself was unaware of this issue, but thinking that this might not be the case at all, he decided to open his father's eyes to it. And when Evan confessed to his father, he replied that he had expected this from his son, Evan. The Marquis understood that Evan was ready to give up his place to his older brother. And then the Marquis allowed Evan to do as he saw fit and promised to give him the support he needed. But then he said that before he could make his dreams come true, he had to grow up. Evan reluctantly agreed to his father's condition. However, his father indicated that Evan could already begin preparations, such as finding a location and organizing people. Father Marquis told Evan that if he failed to accomplish all this by the time he came of age, he would revoke his permission. He also advised him to think about a name, saying that the group could not be called the Dungeon Group forever. Evan then said that he had already come up with a name, and a smile of joy spread across his face. Later, Bernard heard how tired all the pharmacy workers were, because they worked tirelessly without any rest. Evan came to Bernard with the intention of sharing his concerns. Evan told Grandpa Bernard that despite their victory over the epidemic, they still had to remain vigilant. He meant that they should be prepared in case it happened again. Bernard replied that everything would be fine as long as Evan did his job. Bernard meant that the Brotherhood's pharmacy had gained great fame thanks to the cure for the terrible disease. And now the king believes that the world needs pharmacies like the Brotherhood's, not the divine powers of the church. Bernard then shared his suspicion that the king would soon summon the Marquis for an audience on this matter. Bernard said that the best option for them would be to open another Brotherhood pharmacy in the capital. It wasn't long before the king told Evan that he wanted to see him, so they immediately set off for the capital. Evan suggested sending Eric in his place, but the Marquis said that the king had invited Evan specifically. The Marquis then indicated that they would travel in a magical carriage that expanded space, and that he would have time to learn the rules of etiquette. Evan understood that now he would have to practice on slugs even more. Although Evan was going to go to the capital later, he still saw the advantages in this,
because he would be able to catch up on collecting treasures. He hoped to find other clues from the third and fourth parts of the game, and possibly even the first and second parts. After 2 whole weeks, they arrived at the royal palace, where they were greeted by a crowd of maids. He addressed the palace maids and indicated that he had his own servants and would not need any help from others. Evan understood that the servants who worked here were far more dangerous than another stranger, and he could not predict what might happen. Evan said aloud that he needed to be extremely careful. The butler then realized that Evan was acting so confused because he was in an unfamiliar place. Evan then began to talk about his premonition regarding the family of Count Bayern and his feeling that something might happen to them. The fact is that the Count of Bayern's family had been destroyed long before the beginning of the third part, and Evan understood that getting involved in their problems would not bode well for them. The butler then suggested that such statements could have a negative impact on the Marquis's decision, but the Marquis himself said that everything was fine because he completely trusted his son. He said that even if his son made the wrong decision, nothing would threaten his family, and he was prepared to spend a large sum of money to teach his younger son a lesson. And indeed, the Marquis was ready to blindly trust his son and his unfounded assumption. Suddenly, the Marquis was informed that people from the palace had arrived. They were told that His Majesty the King was waiting to meet with them and asked them to come to the palace. The Marquis told Evan that his great-grandfather was also the captain of a knightly squadron of the dungeons. He explained that it was at that time that their family received the title of Marquis. It was interesting that upon arrival, aristocrats were usually given a day or two of free time, but Evan and the Marquis were invited to the palace immediately after their arrival in the capital, and it was obvious that the emperor wanted to meet them sooner. When our heroes entered, they knelt to show their respect for the emperor, but the king told the Marquis to abandon all observance and expression of manners. The emperor noted that when he saw the Marquis trying to observe etiquette, it gave him goosebumps. When they sat down at the table, the king glanced at Evan, noting that he was the very boy who had become the famous miracle of the Chardin family. Evan introduced himself and said that it was a great honor for him to be invited to an audience with the king. The emperor said that Evan looked very much like his father, and Evan thanked him for that. The emperor intended to reward them for the unprecedented success of the Brotherhood's pharmacy and suggested opening a similar pharmacy in the capital itself. Evidently, Evan and his father were prepared for such a statement from the emperor. Evan feared that this topic might cause conflict between the emperor and the Marquis, but to his surprise, everything went quite well. In addition to opening the pharmacy, the emperor promised to protect it from the Order of the Great and those who would dare to attack the Brotherhood's new pharmacy. The emperor promised to take care of this with ease, as he had sufficient power and authority to do so. The Marquis addressed the emperor and indicated that all this would only benefit their Brotherhood's pharmacy. Evan understood that they were now talking about the rights to distribute their pharmacy's medicines. The emperor's main goal was to open a pharmacy in the capital and get rid of those who opposed it, and thus protect it. The Marquis believed that it was his family who had stopped the infectious disease, while the capital wanted to take all the credit for itself. And then, Evan decided not to give up on this issue and to help the Marquis's father. Then the emperor turned to Evan, assuming that he was bored here, and suggested that he go for a walk in the garden. Evan thanked the emperor for his concern and was about to object, but was interrupted. The emperor did not allow Evan to finish speaking and ordered the servants to take Evan to the garden for a walk. Evan could not resist the emperor's orders, so he went to the garden and was angry that he would now be unable to help the Marquis. When they arrived in the garden, Evan saw a huge statue of the emperor and was not surprised, so he decided to continue his training with the slugs. Then he turned around and told the servants who were accompanying him that he intended to walk alone. When Evan began training on the slugs, he felt a large amount of mana. Thanks to his study of alchemy, his physical abilities had improved, but what was interesting was that he had not even studied combat skills. Now that the mana problem was solved, all he had to do was summon larger slugs in greater numbers. At the moment, everything was going well, because this way, Evan was able to greatly speed up his training. Suddenly, someone appeared in the garden behind Evan and asked what he was doing, which surprised him. Evan turned around very quickly, frightened, and then asked who was standing in front of him. In front of him was a cute girl with pink hair looking at him. Evan looked at her, noticing her beauty, and for a moment even froze, looking into her eyes. Suddenly, he noticed that the girl was holding worms in her hand. Then she held out her hand with the insects to Evan and offered to let him hold them. But Evan, completely terrified, refused. Then she began to look at him, saying that he was as cute as the worms in her hands. Evan continued to look at her, thinking to himself that this girl was extremely strange. Evan noted that he had never seen anyone with hair of that color before. He thought that it all looked cute, and that this girl was definitely different from Belle. After thinking for a moment, he remembered her and guessed that her name was Serena. It turned out that it was indeed Serena L. Sokline, the Emperor's beloved youngest daughter. Then Evan thought that the Emperor had planned this meeting between Evan and his daughter from the very beginning. He understood that the Emperor had decided to use his lovely daughter to enlist the support of the innocent Evan. Evan realized that things were bad because now he was again at risk of ending up on his deathbed. And at that moment, Serena introduced herself, stating her age. Then she asked Evan to introduce himself, and he gave his name and age, and Serena noted that Evan was older than her. Then she asked him why he was taking the lives of the creatures in his hands. She explained that these creatures begged him not to hurt them, and did not understand why Evan was depriving them of their right to exist. When Evan asked her what these creatures were saying, she said she could no longer hear them. She suggested that most likely, everyone she had heard had already passed away. Evan suddenly remembered that Serena was a key character who had been kidnapped in the fourth part of the game and had begun to control the monsters. And then, after what Serena told him, he realized that she was able to subjugate monsters and control them. He understood that hardly anyone knew about her ability because she lived a peaceful life within the walls of the palace. And then Evan decided not to lie to her because she had already seen that he was able to summon monsters. And then he explained to her that he was doing it for his own salvation. He explained that with the help of these trainings, he was becoming stronger, and if he didn't do it, he would soon lose his life. She then noted that this world is very cruel, and there is nothing that can be done about it. But she asked Evan to release at least one of these little slugs. Pointing to the pendant, she said that if he summoned one little slug, it would not attack him. And when Serena pointed to the pendant, it suddenly lit up with a red light. Suddenly, Evan understood something and suggested that the princess take a walk by the fountain, because in his opinion, it might be dangerous here. Now, thanks to his training, Evan was able to summon slugs with different abilities, and he summoned a fire slug. Serena noted that this slug was very cute and looked like a precious stone, and Evan decided to give it to Serena as a gift. He explained that he wanted to give her this gift because the slug was unlikely to obey him. She looked at it and thought it was slightly less cute than a worm, and Evan warned her that it could be dangerous. But Serena didn't seem to want to hear it, and focused all her attention on the cute slug. Suddenly, Serena said that this cute slug had told her that some of its relatives were incapable of thinking. She also told Evan that the slug said most of them lived by instinct alone and attacked everyone they saw. She told Evan that her friend Ruby had told her all this information. Then Evan realized that Serena could read minds and said that it was called a soul contract. Evan said that Ruby could become her protector and that she herself could develop her skills by talking to him. Serena was surprised to learn that it only worked with monsters and not with worms. Now that Serena had made a contract with the slime, she could begin to develop her abilities, and her power of subjugation would immediately increase. Ultimately, this would enable her to avoid being kidnapped by demons. Evan said he could tell Serena about her abilities. A little later, when he returned to the marquee, Evan heard about the king's intentions to arrange his engagement to his daughter, the princess. But it seemed that this sad news did not please Evan at all. Evan told his father that he did not want the engagement to happen at all. Below also became slightly tense when she heard the conversation. The Marquis said that he had refused the king because of Evan's young age, but explained that they would definitely return to this conversation. Evan suggested that all this might be necessary for him to get their pharmacy, but the Marquis said that the king was not interested in the pharmacy or the city of dungeons, let alone. The Marquis explained that the king was only interested in Evan himself, who had founded the pharmacy and prevented the epidemic. And then Evan realized that he now needed to avoid any meetings with Princess Serena. Evan asked the Marquis to tell the Emperor that he was not worthy of his daughter's hand. Serena was worried that protecting Ruby could be dangerous for him. And then she told Evan that she liked him as much as she liked her favorite worms. Evan told his father that the princess would definitely become an unprecedented beauty when she grew up, but he believed that young Bellowa was much more beautiful than Princess Serena. Then Evan told his father that he couldn't understand what kind of person she was and couldn't understand her thoughts. Jokingly, he told his father that he would prefer not to get involved with her. In fact, the Marquis himself had even heard this once because he was worried that Evan really liked the princess. It turned out that His Majesty kept telling the Marquis how wonderful a couple Evan and Serena would make. The Marquis said that negotiations regarding the pharmacy would take place in the next 4 days, and the Emperor asked him to take him along. But then the Marquis noted that if Evan didn't want to go, he could walk around the capital while his father took care of business. Evan was delighted to hear this and thought his father was the best in the world at that moment. At that moment, his joy was interrupted by Serena, who came to Evan with an offer to play together. When Evan looked at his father, the Marquis replied that he had probably been mistaken in his statements. Serena suggested that Evan take a walk, indicating that 2 of her knights would accompany them. Evan tried to avoid meeting Serena, saying he had urgent business, but she said she was ready to go with him. Then Serena turned around and pointed to Bella, noting that Evan had very nice servants. She then suggested that everyone at the Marquis' estate was beautiful, including Evan himself. Evan did not respond to her remarks and asked Bello and Shane to get ready because they were about to leave. Evan suggested going to buy new clothes for them so that they wouldn't have to wear their tight clothes for the next few days. Bella and Shane said they would return to Evan as soon as everything was ready, and were surprised that clothes were being bought for them, too. Serena, realizing that they would all go together, did not hide her joy. Evan explained to Serena that his servants were his close friends who had become servants for certain reasons and were very dear to him. Serena also told Evan that her father knew what had happened to them earlier and how Evan had given Serena a slug. She told her father that she liked Evan as much as she liked worms, and her father, the Emperor, immediately understood everything. Evan realized that the situation was taking a serious turn and that at this rate, the engagement would be inevitable. Evan began to say that he was trying to teach her freedom, but for some reason, she was putting herself on a leash. But Serena did not understand what Evan was talking about. Evan then realized that it was completely useless to do anything and that he had to come up with something and start acting. And then Evan said he was ready to play with her on the condition that it would remain their secret. Of course, Serena agreed, because right now it was important for her to play with him. And so, our heroes went to the imperial island of Sigurd to go shopping. In one of the shops, they were greeted very warmly and cordially, where the princess and Evan were immediately recognized. Evan wasted no time in asking the salesperson to select the most beautiful outfits for Shane and Bellowa. It was important to Evan that the fabric used to make the clothes had the property of stretching. The salesperson told Evan that their store used special materials for sewing that could change along with the proportions of the buyer's body. Suddenly, Serena suggested buying outfits for each other to preserve their memories of one another. And when our heroes changed clothes, Evan noticed that Shane always chooses dark colors. Shine noticed that Evan, on the contrary, prefers light colors. And Evan explained that this is so he can see traces of blood on his clothes. Then the princess didn't keep us waiting long and asked Evan's opinion about the dress she had chosen. Evan replied that her outfit looked pretty good. Then, behind Evan, Bellowa came out and called Evan to take a look at her as well. Bella looked at him and thanked him for the beautiful outfit. Evan said that the outfit suited Bellowa very well and noted that his heart almost stopped when he looked at her. Serena also noted Bellowa's beauty, and Evan seemed embarrassed at that moment. And when Serena said that Bella was more beautiful than any worm, Bella herself seemed to sink into the ground. It's a pity that only Evan understood that the comparison with worms was the highest praise from the princess's lips. When the outfits were chosen and paid for, the saleswoman thanked them and said it was a pleasure to serve them. Then Evan said he would like to buy another outfit, and the saleswoman listened attentively. Evan said that at the entrance, he saw a red cape with an unusual design that reminded him of an octopus, and asked her to wrap it up. The saleswoman explained that it was an unremarkable cape whose only function was to change size. After listening to her, Evan asked her to wrap the cape better so that no one would guess that he had bought it. Of course, the saleswoman did not understand Evan's desire to purchase this item, but it was not an expensive outfit that could be easily found in a store. It turns out that this cape can summon a giant octopus from the bottom of the sea, and it was this very item that was the reason for their trip to the store today, because once again, something like a treasure hunt had happened. Then they went to a jewelry store, and Evan's eyes were simply dazzled by the variety of jewelry. And when Evan finished his shopping at the jewelry store, he suggested to his friends that they go to lunch. When they arrived at their destination, Shane was completely shocked by the size of the building. Evan explained to Shine that what he was looking at was an estate that had been converted into a cafe. Shine moved closer to Evan and quietly suggested that he choose a better place to eat since they would be joined by a princess. Evan responded by winking at his friend and saying that what he needed was right there in this cafe. And when they went inside, they were greeted by a man who kindly welcomed them. Those inside immediately began discussing what they believed to be guests of the capital. When they saw the boy with purple hair, they immediately thought that he was the treasure of the Chardon family. Evan asked the hostess to take them to the second room on the right. The man was surprised because guests usually did not favor this room, and therefore they rarely offered it. But Evan didn't care at all, because he probably had a plan in mind, and tossing a coin to the man, he said that they were ready to take this room. Evan offered the Knights of Serena the neighboring room, which he promised to pay for. It didn't take long for the room to be prepared and food to be served at their table. Bella and Shine were extremely impressed by the dishes prepared for them, as they looked very appetizing. Evan asked Princess Serena how she felt in this place, and she replied that everything was fine, and she liked it very much. But suddenly, Shine felt a bitter cold in the room,
that made him shiver. Evan turned to Shine and Bellua and told them to follow his lead as he picked up his cutlery. Then Evan continued speaking and warned them that he would kick Belle and Shine out if they made a mistake. He began to teach them that they should start with the soup first, and then, after a 1-minute break, they should move on to the salad and bread. Only after that did he tell them to start on the fish and taste it. Then he explained that after another minute, they should start on the steak. Then they should try a piece of cake and some excellent Earl Grey tea. Evan, sitting directly opposite Shane, asked if he liked this kind of food, and he replied that everything was fine. Shane noted that it was not the food at all, but the cold he felt when eating hot food. Suddenly, they heard voices that sounded as if they were eating with them at the same time. Shane immediately began to worry that someone else was probably there, but Evan told Shane not to worry, as if he knew what was going on. Evan said that those they were hearing would not leave until they had finished their meal. Suddenly, a silhouette appeared right above the table, which scared Shane very much. The girl who appeared above the table thanked them for ordering so much food and said that she was able to eat her fill. Then she simply disappeared, saying that now she wanted to sleep. And then Evan said aloud to Shane that the event was over and everything was finished. Suddenly, Evan caught himself thinking that he had accidentally used gaming slang. Then he asked his friends if they had noticed that there was a ghost in the room. Evan explained that they had just helped this girl calm down. Now, they were able to let this ghost girl enjoy the food she loved when she was alive. This event helped them increase their level of existence and improve their skills by 10%, and the effect extended to the entire team. Serena asked what the ghost gave them in return for the food, and Evan replied that she gave them her blessing, and that they had nothing to worry about. Serena said she could understand this because she began to feel warmth. Bella looked at her hands and felt as if she had gained new strength. When Shine asked what had happened to the ghost, Evan replied that the girl had left this world. Upon their return, Evan asked Belle to lock the door so that no one could enter. Then Evan said it was time to look at their catch for the day and spread the bundle out on the table. After counting everything on the list, there were 32 items, which was many times more than Evan had expected to find. Bella asked if it was okay to lay out all these jewelry items on a regular cloth, worried that it might damage them. But Evan explained that everything she saw before her were artifacts, and that they had their own protection against damage. Serena became curious as to why artifacts were being sold in a regular jewelry store, but Evan said that the reason was simply that people did not know that they were artifacts. He explained that there are no artifacts in the mine that can be recognized immediately, and some only become artifacts over time. He said that there are artifacts that only open when they meet their owner or when they are powered by mana. Serena thought for a moment and then said that there was a person in her palace who controlled artifacts. Evan agreed and explained that an ordinary person could see artifacts every day, but not understand that they were artifacts. That is why Evan said that jewelry stores suffer periodic losses simply because they do not know what they are selling. When Serena wanted to ask Evan a question, he immediately interrupted her and said that it was a trade secret. He understood that Serena most likely wanted to know how Evan was able to recognize the artifacts. Then Serena noted that all the artifacts she saw in front of her were very beautiful and asked Evan for one as a gift. But Evan replied that it was not good and extremely rude to beg for things. She suggested asking her father for an artifact in exchange for the gift and giving it to Evan. Evan agreed to this deal, allowing her to take only one artifact. After all, he couldn't refuse, knowing that the princess could give him an artifact from the imperial palace. Evan looked at her and said that she must keep her promise because it was a deal. But Serena explained that she didn't consider it a deal, but simply an exchange of gifts. She said that she wanted to create memories in this way. And when Serena asked Evan to choose a gift for her, he couldn't find anything better than a Tiger Triumph pendant that was suitable for contracts. He gave her the pendant and said that it would increase her level of success in the event of future failure, and that if she imbued it with mana, it would create a protective barrier. Suddenly, they began to observe an unusual glow, different from anything Evan had seen before. Serena said that her knowledge had increased, and she felt that the pendant had recognized her as its owner. Now it was time to tell her about the artifact Evan needed, and he asked Serena to make sure it was definitely in the Imperial Palace. Serena said she was ready to bring the artifact to Evan, even if it turned out to be her father's Imperial sword. When Evan escorted Serena to the palace, she promised to see him tomorrow and be sure to bring what they had discussed. Evan understood that bringing this artifact should not be particularly difficult or cause any problems, so he was calm. After that, Evan said it was time to find an artifact for Bellua as well. Evan suggested that she might also like to receive something as a gift, but Bellua refused in every way. Evan told Bellua that this was not a deal like the one with Serena, but simply
a gift from him. He decided to give her earrings called Breath of the Volcano, which would increase her mana regeneration and enhance her flame attributes. He said that these earrings were like a universal attribute. Balua knew that these earrings were connected to another pair of earrings called Winter Breath, and it was precisely the Winter Breath earrings that Evan wore, and Belua said she couldn't accept them. Bella felt awkward because she didn't think she deserved such a gift, but she couldn't refuse Evan either. Evan said that sometimes it's okay to be capricious and give free rein to your emotions. Bella replied that if she gave free rein to her emotions because of him, something terrible might happen. But this came as a surprise to Evan because he couldn't remember ever treating her badly, and he told her so. Bella said it was just a joke, but Evan knew who she would become in the future, and therefore considered it to be true. Evan asked her to tell him right away if she was upset about something and promised to solve all her problem. Then Balua thanked Evan for the gift and noted that from now on, Evan could just call her Lua. Staying in his room and opening the curtains, Evan thought that he was hunting for treasures that would protect him in the future. Today, he decided not to visit the places of the aristocrats, but to look for the hidden shops of the capital. And telling Shane that great deeds awaited them, he also noted that he hoped the princess would leave their company very soon. Suddenly, he noticed something about Shane and realized that something was definitely wrong with him. Evan asked Shane if Balua had any complaints about him. Evan noticed that he had fainted yesterday, but on the way back, everything was fine. Then Evan noted that Shane resembled a guy who had been dumped by his girlfriend while he was in the army. Shane shared with Evan that he had noticed that his body had become heavy. He said that even after he received the blessing, he still felt cold all the time, and his body had become heavier. And when Shine said that he felt like someone was watching him, Evan thought about it. It seems that Evan understood what was going on and gave Shine some bracelets to wear for a while. These bracelets are called ghost bracelets, and they increase movement and attack speed by 15%. When Shine put on the bracelets, Evan asked how he felt, and Shine said that his movements had become faster, but the heaviness in his body remained. Shane continued moving, and Evan suddenly saw something behind him. Of course, Evan couldn't help but ask what his friend Shine had just done, but he said he hadn't done anything. Suddenly, the ghost of the girl they had fed earlier appeared and noted that this place was quite cozy. Of course, our heroes were extremely frightened at that moment. Evan addressed her, saying that he was sure she had left this world, but the ghost thought the same until she woke up next to Shine. Shane shouted, asking her to leave, because it was because of her that he felt heavy. But she said that despite her numerous attempts, nothing had worked. Then she suggested that Shane was simply possessed by someone. Evan decided to clarify her words about comfort, and she looked at them with interest. Then she looked at Shine's bracelets and said that, in her opinion, they looked very comfortable. She said that just looking at these bracelets calmed her soul. She asked to settle into the bracelets, assuming that this would make Shine's heaviness and coldness disappear. And when Shane allowed her to do so, Evan asked her to stop, but she seemed not to hear Evan's request and began to hide, heading straight for Shane's bracelets. Evan thought about it and realized that he was facing an event that he had never seen or experienced before. Suddenly, she said from inside the bracelet that she felt very comfortable there and that it seemed to her that these bracelets were made just for her. Evan then thought about the name of these bracelets and how they could have originally been inhabited by a ghost. Looking at Shayna, Evan realized that they had made an accidental but very important discovery. Evan thought that most likely, these bracelets had the ability to develop along with the ghost living in them. Evan then advised Shane to think of the bracelets as something useful, but Shane couldn't do that because the spirit was still with him. At that moment, Shine continued to listen as the ghost raved about her new home and the handsome man who carried her home in his arms. It wasn't long before Serena returned and said that everything was ready and asked Evan about his plans for the coming day. Evan, in turn, turned to Shine and quietly asked him not to tell the girls about what had happened. Serena approached Evan and handed him the beautiful gift she had promised him. Evan was simply delighted, as he had not expected to receive this artifact in the third part of the game. Serena said that this artifact had been lying in the palace for a long time, and no one knew how it worked. But Evan, feeling a certain sense of pride, promised to show how the artifact worked. It turned out that the power of this artifact was to remove any restrictions. Evan realized that now he could remove the restrictions on artifacts for enhancement and wear 6 artifacts instead of 5. For a character who could lose his life at any second, this artifact was simply indispensable, and Evan knew it. Suddenly, he stabbed the weapon right into his hand, saying that by doing so, he was removing all restrictions. Suddenly, everyone could see a bright glow coming from Evan's hands, but no one understood what it was. He explained to his companions that this artifact allowed him to enhance the effects of the artifacts he already had. Evan turned to the princess and suggested that she return if she was tired of such journeys, saying that today would be a difficult day. Meanwhile, Shine asked the ghost to hide because he had already fed her, but she said that was impossible because they were connected by bracelets. When our heroes arrived at the market, Serena noted that Evan wasn't buying much today, even though they had already been to many places. Evan wondered if the artifact he had given her increased her endurance, because she was not tired at all, unlike the others. Suddenly, Evan suggested that his companions go eat, saying that he knew a good place nearby. It wasn't long before our heroes found themselves in front of the building Evan had mentioned. The place was called Friendly Fist, and everyone was curious how Evan knew about it, but he replied that he had heard about it before. The thing is, in classic games, such establishments help players find partners and are also where the main quests take place. Evan reasoned that this was where the Silent Knight always lived, but Shine was curious to know if they served alcohol here. Evan replied that Shane's concerns were pointless, since they had come during the day and were accompanied by several adult knights. The reason they came here was because of the most talented mercenaries in the entire empire. And because people in this place were often rude, one knight posted guards and ordered them to be on alert. When our heroes entered, everyone immediately saw the girl's pink hair and realized that she was the Emperor's daughter. Evan couldn't get used to this reaction, which happened every time. Evan asked to be shown to a large table and to be brought 7 portions of the establishment's signature dish. Shane had a feeling that the most powerful people in the Empire gathered in this place, and Evan agreed with him. Lua was also concerned about the reasons for their presence in such a dangerous place. Evan, in turn, admitted that he dreamed of finding another treasure here. This time, Evan's treasure was not an object, but a real person. Evan put his arm around Lua's shoulders and asked him not to worry about anything, especially since they had guards with them. When Shine heard Evan address Belua using the diminutive and affectionate term Lua, he was extremely shocked. Belle simply turned away from Shine demonstratively, without giving any explanation. Evan noted that Shine's behavior was comparable to that of a brother whose sister had just brought home her new boyfriend. The princess immediately rushed over to Belle and asked for permission to address her as Lua as well. But Bello only apologized in response, making it clear that she could not allow the princess to do so. Then it was time for lunch, and our heroes gathered together at the table where extremely fatty dishes had been prepared for them. Evan carefully savored the taste of dishes that he had previously only seen on screen. At the moment, Evan's plan was to find the regular characters from the Demon Battle series, but looking at the people around him, Evan realized that he couldn't see them, and noted that luck might not always be on his side. Evan was upset to realize that they would soon have to leave the capital, and thought that maybe he could come back here tomorrow. Suddenly, just when he seemed to have given up hope, he saw a familiar face. He saw a man wearing a priest's robe, under which steel armor was hidden, and then Evan realized that he had found the one he was looking for. It was the strongest boss of the 4th part of the game, named Ryan Drukas, who was called the Unbreakable Shield. He was a boss from a simple quest, and all he did was block attacks and restore health. Defeating him was extremely difficult, and the reward was simple loot. So after winning, players felt defeated. But Evan couldn't understand why this character was sitting in this place with a mug of the cheapest booze. Suddenly, Dane turned to Evan and said that he had noticed the same thing. The fact is that Ryan was a fairly well-known person and, as a child, attracted attention with his divine power. And according to the game, he was supposed to go to training to become a holy knight. Dane said that Ryan was not cut out for battle, but was very stubborn and probably failed anyway, while Evan looked at him with curiosity. Evan suggested that Ryan had just given up everything and embarked on the path of a priest. Dane said that he had to follow the orders of the order for 10 years in order to be able to retake the exam to become a holy knight. And then it became clear that Ryan had bought alcohol to drown his sorrows after his defeat. Suddenly, Princess Serena approached Evan and suggested that he talk to that man. She noted that Evan's eyes had shone in the same way when he met her, and Evan asked her not to say that because her words could be misunderstood. Evan decided to talk to him anyway, and found himself next to the table where Ryan was sitting. Evan turned on his charm and asked permission to sit next to him. Then Evan introduced himself and gave his name and the name of the family he belonged to. Suddenly, Ryan jumped up from the table and began aggressively asking Evan why such an aristocrat suddenly wanted to sit next to him. When Evan finally sat down next to him, Ryan began to share his experiences and said that he had sworn an oath to become a holy knight. And while Ryan was sharing his thoughts with Evan, he thought that if the game's plot and Ryan's story were to be believed, he had had a huge supply of mana since his youth. He was completely helpless in magic and studied under an aristocrat from another country who advised him to become a priest. But one day, while trying to protect someone, he received a blessing and decided to become a holy knight. Meanwhile, Ryan continued to complain to Evan that among the huge selection of weapons, there was none that was right for him. Evan realized that his fate was somewhat similar to his own life, as he was also deprived of talent and rejected by all his mentors. Ryan continued to shout that everyone wanted him to give up the idea of becoming a holy knight, but he did not want to give up. When Ryan mentioned some kind of power, Evan didn't hear him clearly and asked him to repeat it. Ryan explained that only those who are capable of sacrificing themselves for the good of others receive the blessing of the defender, which is why he was attacked. He told Evan that this happens all the time, and that this power increases when he activates the divine call that all knights learn. Evan understood that it was this skill that made this quest so difficult and unfair. Evan replied that Ryan had a very useful skill for someone who wanted to protect others. But Ryan's response was to become extremely angry that Evan shared his opinion. Ryan did not understand and lamented how he had ended up in such a life, and did not understand why God had deprived him of combat skills. Suddenly, Evan asked him if he had managed to protect people with the blessing he had received. Evan explained that Ryan's powers were given to him for defense, not for attack. Ryan said that he managed to use his power when all the monsters started attacking him, and he ran away from them until he led them away from the people. Ryan considered this ability to run away pathetic for someone who had received a blessing. But Evan said he thought it was a really cool ability. Evan explained that he thought it was cool when a talented person entered into battle because such an act required courage. As a plus, Evan noted the desire to protect people, even without knowing that the blessing he had received would not help him in battle. Then, speaking about his actions, Evan noted that he considers him a hero for lending a hand to those in need of protection. Ryan was extremely embarrassed because no one had ever said such words to him before. Looking at Ryan's reaction, Evan realized that everything was going according to plan again. Suddenly, Ryan got up from the table and said he didn't need any more drinks. Evan responded by telling him that he thought Ryan would make an excellent holy knight. Ryan replied that this question no longer bothered him at all. But this reaction was not at all what Evan expected from Ryan. Ryan said that after talking to Evan, he no longer cared about other people's opinions. Ryan then said that he intended to focus on what he wanted and would continue to protect people, regardless of the opinions of others. After that, Evan realized that the situation had turned out even better than he had planned. Evan then said that since Ryan had made up his mind, he asked permission to introduce himself again. Ryan Drukas then introduced himself in response and said that he was from the Drukas family that had defeated the dragon many years ago. Ryan Drukas then thanked Evan for listening to him. Evan said that even though he was the second son of the Marquis, he did not plan to become the head of their family. He then explained that he intended to create his own order of knights and decided to invite Ryan to join his future order. Evan offered him this, explaining that he had a gift for protecting other people. Then, turning on his charm and putting on a sweet expression, he suggested that they protect their city together. But Ryan suddenly said that he did not deserve such an offer and such a prestigious job. But then he told him that if Evan, knowing Ryan's shortcomings, was offering him this, then he would not miss such an opportunity. And when the decision was made, Evan said that Ryan Drukas was now on his team. Evan's remaining companions watched from the balcony above as Ryan became a member of their order of knights. It wasn't long before our heroes returned to the palace with the treasures they had obtained. And when the Marquis, in shock, asked Evan where he got it all, he replied that he had acquired it all by chance on the way back. Evan said that with the help of these riches, he would be able to found his own order of knights. The Marquis understood that he was afraid of what Evan would become, given that he was so intelligent at such a young age. And now that Evan had found all the hidden treasures, he could leave the capital without regret, without regretting anything at all. Then the Marquis asked Evan who had come with him, and asked him to introduce him. Evan pointed to Ryan and explained that he was the newest member of his team, whom he had been lucky enough to meet in the capital. Ryan, in turn, introduced himself and said that he had sworn an oath to the young gentleman that he would join his order of knights. Evan explained to his father that he intended to use the artifacts to free him from the Order of the Great. Then the Marquis took on the responsibility of managing affairs in the capital. Evan managed to collect all the artifacts and increase the number of artifacts he could use. He hired Ryan as a new knight in his order, and now the Brotherhood's pharmacy will open in the capital as well. Princess Serena asked Evan to stay with her in the capital, and the news that the Emperor had allowed Serena to leave the capital with Evan left him completely stunned. Evan told her that he intended to return to the City of Dungeons and would probably never return to the capital. But he also noted that he was glad to have spent these 4 days with the princess and promised never to forget them. Serena noted that Evan spoke as if they would never be able to meet again. But Evan understood that now he would not have to face death because his father, the Marquis, had rejected the engagement proposal. Evan then explained to Serena that she was a real treasure and that the world outside the palace walls was extremely dangerous and she should not leave the palace. Evan tried to explain to her that only she could protect herself in times of danger and that she needed to be strong and learn to survive. And when he saw the loving eyes of Serena in response, Evan realized that things were definitely bad. Then Serena said that she would definitely become strong and then be able to leave the palace on her own. She then said that in order to come to Evan, she would definitely become stronger. She said she was ready to become stronger in order to become part of his order of knights. And then Evan replied that Serena had the right to do whatever she thought was necessary. And then, looking Evan straight in the eyes, she asked him to call her by her nickname when they met again. She asked him to use the name Ray to address her when they met again. Meanwhile, at Belua, at the moment of what was happening, a fire of rage seemed to ignite in her body. As he said goodbye to Serena, Evan realized that he had probably made a strong impression on her. At that moment, Evan dreamed that Serena would be engaged to some worthy man before she came to him. And when our heroes were already in the carriage on their way home, Ryan thought that many dangers could arise on his master's path. Shane informed Ryan that all kinds of dangers awaited the young master at every turn. Shane said that their master's safety was their main goal in the entire underground city. Ryan said that it didn't matter to him where he would have to protect the man who had given him a new meaning in life. But then Ryan remembered that he completely lacked the necessary skills and said that he considered himself absolutely useless. Evan reminded Ryan that he couldn't wield a sword, but he didn't say he was useless. Evan said that even though Ryan was bad at fighting, he was simply unmatched in defense. Evan then explained that God had given him this blessing for a reason, and Ryan was surprised by this statement from the young Evan. Ryan did not understand how he could defend someone without being able to fight. Evan asked him to listen carefully, saying that Ryan needed to find a special weapon that matched his abilities. And then Ryan finally understood that all this time, Evan had been talking to him about a shield that he could use, and that would only help him. Evan reminded Ryan of the day he attacked the monsters, because that was when he acquired a new skill for himself. When Princess Serena said goodbye to Evan, she kissed him on the cheek, and Lo, seeing this, was furious. Then Ryan told his young companions that he remembered that day of fighting monsters with shame. He was devastated that he couldn't defeat anyone, and promised himself he would find a suitable weapon. But after Evan's words, Ryan realized that he should be proud of those memories and completely changed his mind on the matter. Everyone in the carriage listened with emotion as Ryan declared his readiness to change, realizing that he could not cope and become perfect on his own. And then he made a decision and was ready to train in shield control. Evan said that they would definitely make a great team if Ryan took on the defense and left the attacking skills to others. And now, the Unbreakable Shield, the Silent Knight, and the Crimson Witch are on the same team. Evan managed to create his dream team because this is no longer a game, and even the final boss would be afraid to stand against them. Suddenly, Ryan asked if Evan himself was going to fight with them, mentioning that Evan meant the team when he said we. Ryan didn't understand why Evan would put his own life at risk and danger. Suddenly, Belua supported Ryan, saying that Evan could rely on them and that he shouldn't go into battle himself. Evan replied that he appreciated his comrades' efforts and concern, but said that he simply had to go to the dungeon. But he also noted that he intended to support his team in some other way, and reminded them of his alchemy lesson. Evan explained to Ryan that he had met someone who was truly talented, and was now learning from him. Evan looked out the window of the carriage they were in, and told his companions that it seemed they had arrived at their destination. Our hero's team arrived in the hot spring town of Stemma. The hot spring town of Stemma is located near the dormant volcano Meganaut and is a very popular tourist destination in Silkline. Shane and Belua were extremely surprised because they had never been to hot springs before. Ryan said he had heard that there was a hot spring in his hometown, but he had never been there either. Marquis asked his son if he could withstand the hot water. Evan replied that he couldn't wait to go there because there was nothing more beneficial for the body than hot water. Evan had also loved hot springs in his past life, so he couldn't pass up this opportunity on his way from the capital. The Marquis said that at the hot springs, no one cares about titles, as many people think. But the Marquis also said that women were given a lot of attention there, so he asked Belua to go to the women's section. Shane asked Belua not to worry, but she angrily told him to be quiet. Later, Evan went to his friend's room to check on them and find out if they had settled in.
Evan said that before going to the hot springs with his father, he decided to rest a little and go there in the evening.
Shane suggested that Evan had come to them not just for no reason, but to say something important. Evan agreed with Shine and said that there was a dungeon not far from there. Evan said that this underground cave had appeared naturally and was not very large, so they had not built a city around it. Shane was horrified to think that his young master intended to go down there. Evan said that this time, Shine was wrong and reminded him that they were still not strong enough for dungeons. Ryan remembered at that moment that Evan had said that Shine and Belua were demigods. Ryan said that there were 3 dungeons around which cities had been built. The first was the Chardon dungeon, located in the territory of Silkline. There is also a dungeon on the Manafarati Road in the Magical Kingdom. The third dungeon is the Murden dungeon on the Trading Consummate. Evan said that in addition to these dungeons, there are several more medium-sized ones, but the only dungeons where you can receive a blessing are those located in dungeon cities. Evan said that the nearby dungeon is inaccessible to many warriors due to its high level of difficulty, but it has no relation to the Great Ones. Evan said that anomalies occur around such dungeons and mana gathers there. Evan said that artifacts may be hidden and appear in those places. Evan said that he intended to take a whole hot spring for himself and planned to create a hot spring in their city. And so, evening came and our heroes set off for the hot spring. Suddenly, Shine turned to Evan with a question that interested him. The thing was, when Shine saw the hot spring for the first time, he was afraid of boiling in the water because it seemed too hot to him. Evan asked Shine not to worry and suggested he look at Marquis, who was already in the water. But Shine reminded him that he was a demigod, and therefore weaker than the others, which is why he was worried. Evan jokingly pushed his friend into the water, saying that he would lose his life right then and there. After Shane's prolonged cries that it was too hot for him, he was finally able to relax and enjoy the temperature of the water. Shane noted that his body aches after training were disappearing. Evan said that the hot spring was much more powerful than simple healing magic. Evan said that the spring was not only capable of healing wounds and strengthening muscles, but also made one stronger. Marquis noted Evan's knowledge on the subject and explained why knights used to undergo long training sessions in Stame. Shane asked Evan if the spring would be more effective if they came here after training. Then Shine shouted that he dreamed of having their own hot spring. After our heroes got out of the water and changed into clean clothes, Shine noted that he felt as light as a feather. Suddenly, Ryan said that the style of these clothes reminded him very much of the clothes from his homeland and thought that the creators of these clothes were his compatriots. It wasn't long before Lua joined them and asked Evan how he managed to find the hot springs. Evan looked at Bella and realized that she was very uncomfortable in these clothes, but she was trying not to show it. Suddenly, a man appeared behind them, shouting that he hadn't finished talking. He yelled at Bella for ignoring the person talking to her, saying that it was rude. She replied that she had nothing to say to him because her young master was there. He yelled that he would be the best master for her because there could be no one better than him, Duke Crow von Ferrati. Evan knew him from the game as the famous Crow von Ferrati, who is the only non-player character who introduces himself. He is an important secondary character in the game because he is the eldest in his family, but since his youth, he has not been the most pleasant person. Suddenly, someone addressed him by name, and he became even more furious than he had been before. And when he saw the Marquis de Chardin in front of him, he immediately calmed down. He immediately bowed and apologized for daring to shout so loudly. The Marquis asked about any issues that might have arisen with his family, and also asked about Belua and the reasons for shouting at her. But the young boy said that Belle was not to blame at all, and began to justify himself. And when he said that below was very beautiful, Evan immediately became angry. Evan knew that if the main character were here, he would immediately stand up for Belua, but Evan himself was a secondary character who could die at any moment. Evan also knew that Crow would become a talented, sword-wielding mage in the future, and believed that he was already good at it. Instead of putting himself in an awkward position, he decided to let his father, the Marquis, decide everything for him. The Marquis agreed with Crow's statements because Belua was indeed very beautiful, but then, with a sudden change in his expression, he asked Crow if he had allowed himself to do something inappropriate towards her. Below apologized to Evan for involving him in this senseless quarrel. Evan replied that there was nothing to apologize for and said that she was indeed very beautiful. Bella was embarrassed by Evan's words, but she thanks him for the compliment anyway. Then Crow looked at Evan and asked the Marquis who he was, and the Marquis replied that this boy was his youngest son. The Marquis looked warmly at his son and asked him to greet Crow von Ferrati. Evan did so, bowing politely and introducing himself. Crow asked Evan about Belua and Evan replied that she was his personal servant, whom he had found and hired himself. When Evan asked if Crow had some business with Belua, Crow agreed with this statement. Crow said that Belua was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen, and then turned to the Marquis. He then pointed his finger at Evan, thereby challenging him to a duel for the beautiful Belua. Everyone standing there at that moment was extremely shocked by what was happening. The situation came as a surprise to Evan, and he thought that Crow had come straight from the Middle Ages. The Marquis, however, was distracted, saying that a duel was very entertaining. Then the Marquis said that although he did not praise Crow for his actions, he noted that he thought like a real man. The Marquis turned to Evan and said that he agreed to their duel for Belle. Evan understood that he did not want to interact with the main characters of the game in this way. Evan decided to refuse the duel, explaining that Below was not an object that anyone could claim. In that case, Crow asked that if he won the duel, Below be set free so that he could ask her again if she would agree to be with him. And when Crow said that in this way, they would both show her respect, Evan realized that he hadn't thought about it at all. They were immediately joined in their conversation by someone who said that he did not want anyone to hurt anyone else. That is why the Marquis forbade the use of weapons and suggested that they fight hand to hand. Without wasting any time, the Marquis suggested they start their duel right away. The Marquis whispered in his son's ear that he should show Crow what he was capable of, since he was not even the captain of the nightly squad. And when they stood facing each other, Evan reassured himself that it was an unarmed fight, and, moreover, that his father was watching what was happening. Then Evan calms down and prepared himself for the moment to prove himself. Although Evan was not the main character, he understood that he was not so weak that he could be defeated by someone who was not the main character. And then Evan said that he would only accept the duel if no one held a grudge in case of defeat. And when Evan released his aura, Crow and everyone standing there were amazed. Despite this, Crow reassured himself that he had been honing his skills for 3 years. And when Crow began to attack, Evan noticed that he was moving too slowly and did not understand why. Then Evan figured that Crow's physical abilities weren't that great. Everyone who watched their fight understood that young Mr. Evans' reactions were extremely quick. At the moment of Crow's attack, Evan even had time to think about what he could do and how to proceed. In the end, Evan decided to dodge the blow by ducking down. Then, without wasting any time, Evan was able to deliver a counterattack that hit his target right on the mark. Absolutely everyone who witnessed what happened was in complete shock, as they had no idea that young Evan was capable of such things. Evan realized that he had barely touched his opponent and decided to turn around to see how Crow would react. But when Evan turned around, he saw Crow lying on the floor, clearly defeated. When Evan asked Shine why Crow was lying on the floor, Shine replied that it was because of his punch. Evan didn't understand how he could have caused such damage, because he hadn't hit him very hard. Then Marquis said that Evan had won their fight. Evan realized that everything was going completely against his plan, because he couldn't defeat a character who was more important than himself. After thinking for a moment, Evan realized that Crow was focused on magic rather than combat skill. And then Evan realized that he was very lucky that they were using hand-to-hand combat in the battle and not magic. The Marquis looked at his son and was happy to see that Evan was very modest and attentive to his opponent. Ryan and Shine also realized at that moment that Evan himself was unaware of his abilities. Bella did not remain on the sidelines either and told Evan that it was a wonderful duel. Bella was holding a handkerchief in her hand, and Evan asked what it could mean. Bella was embarrassed, but still said that she had prepared the handkerchief to wipe the sweat from Evan's face. Evan couldn't help but appreciate Bella's gesture and thanked her for her concern. Suddenly, Crow woke up, and everyone realized that Ryan's healing magic worked quite quickly. Bella looked at Evan with admiration, and then told him that he was simply amazing. Later, when Crow got to his feet, he thanked Evan, saying that their duel had been simply wonderful. Evan replied that he was just lucky, because under different circumstances, he would have lost. Crow then expressed his desire to fight Evan in an unrestricted duel, but Evan immediately refused. Evan said he had absolutely no reason to fight, but Crow said he had a couple of ideas. Leaving the place, Crow said he would definitely return when he was confident in his abilities. Evan understood that he would probably face a global problem because he really didn't want to get involved with the Ferrati family. But suddenly, Shine said that when Crow returned, he would be ready to fight him instead of Evan. Evan ran up to Shine and thanked him, saying he was simply the best. Suddenly, the Marquis noted that he didn't know Meltor would be there, but now that they knew, they should welcome him. He told everyone to go to their rooms, except Evan, because he had to go with his father. Seeing Evan's look, the Marquis explained that this was mandatory and not up for discussion. The Marquis reminded his son that he would soon be making his debut as an aristocrat in high society. It wasn't long before the Marquis and Evan met Maltar himself. Then the Marquis turned to Mrs. Ferrati, noting that she looked beautiful as always. and she thanked him for the compliment. Suddenly, she turned to Evan and said that he had grown a lot and had become extremely charming. Evan replied that he vaguely remembered Mrs. Ferrati, but nevertheless noted that he was glad to meet her. Meltor himself noted that Evan looked very much like his mother, and the Marquis replied that Evan had inherited his eyes. Mrs. Ferrati noted that Evan would be 11 next year, and that their Alicia was the same age. Alicia stood behind her father, who asked her to greet Evan and introduce herself. Suddenly, Alicia stepped forward and greeted Evan, introducing herself. Looking at her, Evan realized that although she was young, she was already significantly different from the other characters in terms of her level. The fact is that from the very first part to the last, she most often appeared in the game as the main character. Alicia is the main character of the third part of the Battle of Demons. And the most interesting thing was that she holds the record for the number of attempts to send Evan to the other world. She never sent Evan to his death with her own hands, but she always stood behind it. Suddenly, Alicia's father reminded the Marquis of their agreement to marry their youngest children. The Marquis agreed and said that he remembered their conversation very well. And, of course, the children were extremely embarrassed when they heard this. But Evan was not embarrassed, but concerned that he would once again find himself on the brink of death. In the game, Alicia lived in Chardon because she was engaged to Evan, but when she met the main character, she began to actively support him. Although she seemed cold and unapproachable, she was in love with the main character for his courage, and soon became his first victim in love. In the end, she left Evan, and he couldn't handle it, and ended his own life. Evan spoke of her as a devil from the third part of the Battle of Demons. But Evan himself was much worse at the time, as he was always in the company of other girls despite being engaged. And Evan understood that, according to the game's plot, she would inevitably be the cause of his death again. But at that moment, Evan was comforted only by the fact that he was no longer the Evan of the past, but a completely different person. Evan and Alicia's parents discussed how their children seemed made for each other and looked great together. After meeting with the Ferrati family, the Marquis asked Evan what he thought of the hot springs, and he replied that it was a wonderful place. Then the Marquis suggested that Evan return to the springs after dinner, and Evan turned around. He turned around and told his father that it was a great idea and that he would be happy to visit the springs again. Evan then shared with his father his idea of opening a hot spring in their town. The Marquis, observing Evan's interaction with the opposite sex, thought he needed to talk to him about it. The Marquis replied that he really likes the idea, but that it would require a large, suitable area and terrain. The Marquis said that they could heat the water, but simply heating the water would not make the spring healing. Evan understood that, theoretically, his father was absolutely right, but Evan responded by asking his father about the change in the landscape when the dungeons appeared. The Marquis then began to explain that when an object or monster possesses strong energy, a dungeon is created to change the terrain. A talented mage who has developed all his abilities to the maximum is also capable of changing the terrain and creating a dungeon. The Marquis also explained that it is extremely difficult to understand the process itself and how it happens. Evan replied to his father that they could create their own hot spring and just needed to find the right item. Evan tried to convince his father of the need to do this because it would significantly increase the effectiveness of the dungeon explorers' raids. Later, they all went in search of the object they needed with special powers. Finally, Ryan managed to find the item Evan was looking for. And so, having obtained the item Evan needed, they headed back home. Upon arrival, the Marquis was met by his son Eric, who noted his father's long absence and his sudden desire to open the source. The Marquis said that Eric would be Evan's assistant in this matter, and therefore asked him to listen carefully. Evan said that first of all, they needed to find the right place, as they had done with the Brotherhood's pharmacy. Then Evan suggested 3 options for the location of the hot spring. But then the Marquis intervened, saying that the fee would be high because the pharmacy was made for the poor, while the spring would be for the rich. Evan added that they would have no choice but to pay, because the benefits of the hot springs were worth the money. Eric thought about it and realized that by healing themselves in the spring, they would be able to return to the dungeon much earlier than usual. After listening to everything Evan and the Marquis said, Eric thought this plan was simply excellent. Eric was also concerned about how the church would react to a hot spring with healing powers. But Evan pointed out that they currently had a fairly good relationship with the church, so there would be no problems. Evan also told his father and brother that Grandfather Bernard would increase the healing power of their spring. Evan managed to bring back a fragment of the dungeon's core from his journey. Bernard looked at it and said that although this slab had the power to change the terrain, it still lacked the power to change the dungeon. Bernard decided to take a closer look at the slab and noted that it was impossible to change it. But then Bernard said that it would become the basis of a hot spring and transfer its power to it. When Evan asked if Bernard could do this, he replied that Evan would not need his help. Bernard said that it would take a little alchemy and knowledge of medical technology, and then a hot spring better than Stemma's would be ready. Bernard then turned to Evan and asked if he and his pharmacy staff could visit the hot spring free of charge. Evan turned on the charm and asked his father to allocate a little more land so that he could build a training headquarters. The Marquis said that was no problem at all, and Evan explained that he wanted to set up a training headquarters for his squad there. Evan pointed out that after training his nightly order, it would be quite nice to go to the hot spring. Eric looked at Evan and realized that his brother had thought everything through to the smallest detail, and therefore considered him a simply brilliant child. And so they wasted no time and set off to carry out their plans. When Evan returned home to the palace, Mabel rushed to him with open arms, her face and eyes filled with joy and tears. And when construction of the spring began, Evan personally supervised the entire process. Evan yelled at the workers not to touch the columns with inscriptions under any circumstances, because if they damaged them, they would have to start all over again. Bernard understood that the mana of the stone would not be enough, because they were trying to create a complete location right away. Bernard reiterated to Evan that they first needed to ensure the reliability of the foundation itself. It wasn't easy for Evan either, because he was trying to create something that wasn't in the original game plot. After thinking for a moment, Bernard said that they would need another artifact anyway. Bernard said that they needed a source of mana that would be generated and maintain the functionality of the source. Evan understood that Bernard was talking about the process of accumulating mana from different artifacts, and Bernard did not understand how Evan could know about this. Then Bernard said that if he had the artifacts he had collected himself, everything would work out with 100% certainty. When Evan asked where these artifacts were now, Bernard replied that he had sold them long ago. Suddenly, Evan reached into his pocket and asked Bernard how many artifacts he needed. Evan showed Bernard the artifacts they had brought from the capital and suggested using them. When Bernard saw the artifacts Evan had, he thought that Evan had robbed the Imperial warehouse. Evan said that he had managed to acquire most of the artifacts in jewelry stores in the capital. Bernard then laid out the artifacts in front of him and suggested they continue their work. At that moment, Evan realized that there was no better way to practice his alchemy skills than to create a location using artifacts. Later, when Evan returned to training, his mentor scolded him for skipping it, even if it was due to a multitude of tasks. Then he turned to Evan and said that Shine had told him the story of their duel with the Ferrati family's son. He praised him and said that from now on, there would be many more people who wanted to duel him. But Evan responded by shouting that he had done nothing remarkable. But his mentor disagreed. He told Evan that he was ready to teach him the skill he had mastered in the dungeon, and then no one would be able to tarnish his reputation. The mentor believed that God himself had sent him this skill so that he could teach it to Evan. And after that, without wasting any time, the mentor suggested starting the training immediately. The technique that the mentor showed Evan is called the power of the heavens. The mentor explains that the essence of the power of heaven lies in transferring all of one's power into movement. The mentor said that even he was impressed while learning. And since the mentor considered Evan to be more talented than himself, he was sure that Evan would master it with ease. After training with the mentor, Evan looked like a squeezed lemon. And when Mabel came to announce the start of the etiquette lesson, Evan asked for a little more time to rest. Mabel was particularly serious at that moment, and Evan got the impression that she was angry, even though she denied it. Then she reminded him that Evan had given gifts to Shane and Bella, and said that she wasn't angry at all, but that she was the only one without a gift. Evan said that he hadn't forgotten about Mabel, but was just waiting for the right occasion and moment. And then he took out a heart-shaped pendant and handed it to Mabel. Evan asked Mabel to always wear this pendant as proof that she was on his side. Mabel tearfully thanked Evan and said that she could feel his feelings through this gift and promised to cherish it. Evan began to shout that he had not meant anything like that when he gave her the gift. From early morning, Evan had been waiting for an etiquette lesson taught by the senior maid. Then there were alchemy classes in the midst of the construction of a hot spring. Evan devoted his free time to learning the technique of heavenly power with the captain of the night squad. At the same time, Evan never forgot about training on slugs and devoted his time and attention to it. It wasn't long before Evan learned to summon 4 slugs at once. But as expected, it required more mana, and his stamina reached its limit after training his combat skills. And then Evan realized that he should hurry up and finish building the hot spring. Before starting his day, Evan hugged little Lizzie, telling her how tired he was and that she was his only joy in life. When it was time for Evan's next combat skills training session, his mentor asked him to hit him as hard as he could. The captain of the night squad asked Evan to add weight to his fists, saying that Evan was doing great. The captain said that, in time, Evan would learn to use mana in his strikes, which would make him even stronger. Evan was surprised that he was able to master this practice, and his mentor was just as surprised, as he thought it was impossible to learn. Suddenly, Lua arrived, bringing another handkerchief for her young master, and Evan thanked her for it.
Lua wiped Evan's forehead and told him about the next item on his schedule, and the captain looked at them and envied their relationship and Luo's care. Evan was extremely happy because he said that today they would finally open their hot spring of brother. When they all went inside to see the result, the first thing they noticed was the luxurious interior. The Marquis noted that the design seemed quite modern to him. Evan decided to create this style because the Stemma hot spring was oriental in style, while theirs had a Western style. Shane also examined everything down to the smallest detail and asked Evan to explain what he saw. Evan explained that it was a vending machine where you could insert a coin to get a drink. Evan demonstrated how the machine worked, and soon Shine was standing there, holding a cold glass of milk. Evan used an artifact with the power of space expansion and cooling magic, and placed such a machine on both sides of the locker room. When they went inside, they were all extremely surprised by the size of this source, because it was simply enormous. A large artifact was used for this source and for the water tanks, and with its help, they managed to enhance the effect of the source and purification. Bernard added that at set intervals, a special herbal concentrate was added to the water to enhance the properties of the source. The Marquis inhaled the scent and noted that the water had a pleasant aroma. It wasn't long before all the first guests of the newly created hot spring were in the water. Shayna became curious about the opinion of Belua and other female representatives regarding the created source. Bernard said that despite their good work, one problem remained. The problem was that the entrance fee to the springs was 20 silver coins. Many people were dissatisfied because one coin was enough to eat their fill. Mabel, who was acting as cashier, listened to the complaints of people who thought the price was too high. When Mabel reported what was happening, Evan said that there was no problem at all. And so it happened, because almost immediately, the first payment from their first visitor arrived at the cash register. Evan was right, because many explorers came who would have spent a gold coin to be treated and return to the dungeon. Everyone who came to the new hot spring said that it was much better than Stemma. One of the men ordered his companions to go and tell their guild about this place. He then made a rule that if anyone in the guild did not undergo purification, they would be denied entry to the dungeon. Evan saw the benefit in this, although the situation turned out quite differently. Meanwhile, the girls Belua and Mabel also tried this healing hot spring. Evan understood that everyone who thought it was expensive would still come here at least once. After all, this spring was truly capable of restoring all the body's strength. In addition, this spring has the property of accelerating the process of increasing strength. And now, there is a huge difference between those who have been to the spring and those who have not. And everyone who came to the spring considered Evan a blessing for their entire family. Later, the head of the guild demanded an answer from the knights as to whether they had managed to visit the spring. They all said that they had been there and now felt great. It was the Golden Drake Guild that intended to conquer the 40th floor of the dungeon. Ordinary people, seeing all this, promised themselves to go to the source of brotherhood as soon as they became stronger. Evan compiled statistics after using the source of brotherhood, where professionals began to pass through the dungeon many times faster. Thus, the source of brotherhood became a privileged place for high-ranking researchers. Later, the Marquis reviewed the report and realized that Evan was right about everything, and that the source had generated high profits. Evan knew that his father would be surprised, because the profit from the spring was much greater than that from the 4 existing pharmacies. Many vassals were indignant that they had not been able to invest money in the construction of a pharmacy or a source. But the Marquis replied that he had not invested a single coin of his own money in the construction because Evan had built everything at his own expense. The Marquis told Evan that no one had the right to take credit for his achievements, as he had created everything with his own hands. The Marquis said he regretted that Evan was already involved in such large-scale projects at such a young age. But Evan replied that he was an aristocrat who had a responsibility to the people. In reality, Evan did all this only to avoid his own demise. Evan shared with Mabel that he intended to gradually change the cost of admission to the hot spring and had already prepared something for when the price stabilized. His idea was to introduce a special membership to the hot spring of brotherhood. He decided to divide the special membership into several ranks, which would be awarded depending on the contribution made in the dungeons. In this way, he wanted to make membership a kind of motivation. Evan wanted to make everyone stronger so that they would not have to rely on the appearance of the main character. Mabel turned to Evan and said that he had made a great contribution to the development of the city and that she could no longer imagine the city without him. Mabel explained to Evan that this city needed someone like him. Evan looked out the window and thought that he didn't want to die, but he also didn't want the town he found himself in to fall. He also thought that if the main character died, there would only be a bad ending. He realized that he needed to help the underground city gain its independence. But looking at Mabel, Evan still understood that he was approaching his demise. He thought that he himself could become the main character,
even if it was not meant to be. The next day, Evan brought Bernard the results of his alchemy lessons. Bernard examined everything carefully and said that Evan had finally managed to learn alchemy.
Thus, Grandfather Bernard said that Evan had managed to complete his alchemy training. And when the working day at the Brotherhood's pharmacy was over,
Evan thanked everyone, noting that they had worked hard. Many of the employees wanted to go to the Brotherhood's hot spring after a hard day's work. Assistant Hannah asked Evan if he was going to the hot spring with them, and he replied that he would definitely do so. Shane and Ryan arrived at the hot spring after training, and Ryan said that he wasn't doing very well in training and was still lagging behind. Ryan said he was learning a lot from his younger friend Shane, who said the exact opposite. Ryan said that he trained his physical strength every day, but he had never had a single training session with weapons in his hands. Evan saw that Ryan had excellent physical abilities, but without weapons, they would be useless. Evan turned to Ryan and asked him not to be so categorical. Evan explained to Ryan that he was progressing a little slower because he was following a different path of development. He then said that from now on, Ryan should focus on what he was lacking and make up for it. By this, Evan meant that starting today, Ryan would begin training with a shield. Ryan turned to Evan and said that he had already prepared everything he needed. Evan pointed out that milk from the vending machine was in high demand and that he would soon be able to earn more from it. Suddenly, Evan saw a familiar face in the hot spring, and it was Servina. Servina told Evan that she often came here and noted that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. She said that after coming here, her skin had improved and was simply glowing, so he couldn't deny himself this pleasure. Evan understood that it had a beneficial effect on the skin because the hot spring removes all toxins from the body. But Evan also said that if Servina continued to drink alcohol, the effect would disappear. But she replied that the great Mother Earth had said that truth could be the most powerful weapon in existence. Suddenly, she noticed Ryan and asked Evan about him. Ryan introduced himself and said that at the moment, he was only studying in order to be worthy of being near the young master. Ryan Lucas's words undoubtedly struck the girls' hearts with Cupid's arrow. Hannah was the first to respond, introducing herself as someone who works at the Brotherhood's pharmacy. Then, Servina introduced herself as a church minister. One after another, the girls began to talk about his beauty, and Evan realized that soon, this man would become the terror of all male extras. It wasn't long before Evan gave Ryan his own shield for training. Ryan was delighted and said that the shield reminded him of himself, and promised to protect Evan from now on using it. Evan said that the shield should not be used in dangerous situations because he only needed it for training. Evan jokingly said that they could both lose their lives if Ryan used this shield in battle. Evan tried to explain and asked Ryan if he knew anything about cursed artifacts. Evan explained that cursed artifacts are those that impair the abilities of their owner. And when Ryan realized that he was looking at one of these artifacts, he became slightly concerned. Evan said that many people think this way, although in reality, it is not true at all. Evan noted that sometimes people mistakenly take beautiful artifacts for cursed ones and neglect to use them. It turned out that during the game, Ye Banmin had managed to test this artifact and therefore knew the true value of artifacts in this world. Speaking specifically about this shield, Evan said that blocking an attack with it would result in twice the power. This means that when Ryan repels an attack, it will be equivalent to repelling 2 attacks, thus doubling his skill. Then he said that wearing armor would increase effectiveness 4-fold. Then he put a pendant around his neck and said that now the effectiveness would increase 8-fold. And even though Ryan didn't fully understand everything Evan said, he said that Ryan needed to learn how to use all of this. And so as not to waste time, Evan suggested starting right away and testing all these artifacts. Ryan's training was intense, and he tried to learn and understand how the artifacts worked together. The thing was that instead of protecting Ryan, these artifacts directed all his attacks back at him. Essentially, the pendant should create air arrows using the owner's mana and then direct them to attack nearby enemies. But for some reason, the arrows fly at the artifact's owner. And the only advantage of the pendant is that it consumes a small amount of mana. Moreover, this pendant has the ability to evolve, which means it becomes stronger along with Ryan. The armor that Evan gave Ryan was no less impressive. This armor was known as the Invisible Shield and was famous for its reputation. Due to an internal error, this armor became a defensive artifact rather than equipment. As soon as you put on this armor, it immediately begins to attack its owner. But if you assume a posture in this armor, as if you were holding a shield, the attack will be blocked as if you were actually defending yourself with a shield. In other words, wearing the armor and using the shield is equivalent to a fighter using 2 shields. This was the essence of Ryan's training plan that Evan had devised for him. Next, Evan decided to take on Shine, telling him that it was time to move on to serious training. They talked about how Shane had done a great job with the 2-sword training. He was great at it because he had been doing this training for the past 2 years of his life. Shane said that thanks to this training, his divine vision had improved, and he was able to understand what real combat was. Evan realized that Shine was talking about the transcendent vision that the head butler had taught him. Evan told Shine that he was now ready to go to the dungeon, and that all he had left to do was solve the problem of endurance. After these words, it seemed to Shine that Evan meant that Shine was still not strong enough. Evan replied that all this was happening only because Shine was a demigod. Shane suggested that the more blood that got on his blade, the faster his movements and stamina recovery would be. Evan said that this was an excellent skill for Shane, as he specialized in fighting several opponents at once. Evan tried to explain to Shine that his skills would only get better with time, but Shine was still somewhat upset. He was only upset because this skill could only be improved through real combat, not training. Then Evan gave Shine some jars of monster blood and told him to pour it on his weapon. Evan was going to organize training for Shane in the dungeon until he began to improve this skill. But now, thanks to the Brotherhood's pharmacy and the source, there are many ways to improve Shane's endurance. Evan then said he was confident that Shane would be able to master this skill faster than he had expected. Then Evan decided to explain the main essence of his plan for Shane. He explained how to use each jar step by step and what to do and in what order. Evan explained that this was the best way to improve the skill called Crimson Shadow. Shane was worried that the knights would consider all this a magical ritual and try to catch him. Then Evan began to leave, realizing that he had managed to test Ryan and Shine. And then he thought that at this point, only Bella remained to be tested. But as soon as she finished her work, she immediately left, saying that she had training with the lamp. And then Evan thought that she was definitely hiding something. He thought that he had never asked her about it before because he didn't see anything wrong with it. But clearly, there was something to think about. After all, in order for everyone to enter the dungeon together, he needed to check her progress. He realized that he needed to check on her, no matter what. 2 hours later, he searched everywhere for her and couldn't find her in the places where she should have been at that time. Suddenly, the Marquis's wife appeared behind him and asked who Evan was looking for so desperately. Evan greeted Mrs. Miriam and little Lizzie in return. Miriam said that Lizzie loved him very much, noting that Evan only came to visit them for tea and hadn't been there in a long time. Evan explained that this was because he was too busy and asked Miriam if she had seen Bella. Miriam was surprised that young Evan was still unaware of the news. Miriam explained that his mother, Redding, had been teaching Bellua various skills such as floristry and etiquette for a long time. Miriam explained that his mother saw Bellua as an excellent candidate to be Evan's mistress, and that was obvious. Evan was extremely annoyed by this because he didn't understand who would teach such things to a 9-year-old. Suddenly, Miriam asked Evan's opinion on the matter, her expression changing. But at that moment, Evan could only think about how he had not planned for such an outcome. He understood that he would never have decided to have a romantic relationship with the Crimson Witch. He quickly moved on, realizing that he hadn't had tea with his mother or spent time with her in 3 years. But he also couldn't imagine that his mother could become so bored that she would decide to teach Bellua. Then thoughts began to form in his head that Bellua's skills had rapidly improved. He assumed that she had mastered special skills by training with his mother, as she would have done with a butler or maid. The thing is, in this world, if you train hard and hone your skills, your abilities will soon turn into real skills. And then Evan realized that by training with his mother, Lua had been able to develop her mana abilities. Then, approaching the door, Evan knocked and, introducing himself, indicated that he intended to enter immediately. When the door opened, Redding and Bellua were in absolute shock when they saw Evan. Evan looked at his mother and asked her to explain why she hadn't told him she was a mage. But in response, she only thanked fate that Evan had found out about it because she had wanted this to happen for a long time. Evan was curious to know if his father, the Marquis, knew about her abilities. She explained that the Marquis was not aware of it, but in her opinion, he had probably guessed. This was because no one in the Chardon family had ever possessed magic, but Eric turned out to be very gifted with magical abilities. Redding asked how Evan had figured this out, and Evan replied that there were 4 reasons. The first reason was the Aphronic tea, which activates mana and clears the mind, and they hadn't even touched this drink. Redding noted that Evan was absolutely right about this, and was an extremely observant young man. The second reason for observation was the artifact book that was on the table. After all, it was created to store secrets, as it hides everything that is not written in it. The third reason was the artifact lamp, which, although it was an antique, still glowed faintly immediately after being extinguished. This meant that Lua had been using it until Evan entered the room. Then he explained that the fourth reason was extremely simple, because Bellua could not have developed her powers on her own with only the help of the lamp. Evan then said that he was absolutely certain that his mother, Redding, had been teaching Bellua all this time. Redding noted that her son had a knack for assessing other people's development, and therefore believed that he also had many secrets. Then Evan remembered another thing. His father had aged noticeably during that time, while Redding still looked exactly the same. Evan noted that he used to think she just looked young, but now he realized that was not the case at all. Then Raiden hugged Evan around the shoulders and asked him to remember that she just looked young for her age. Redding asked her son if he had heard anything about witches before. At first, Evan didn't even know what his mother meant, and he certainly didn't know how to answer her question. Evan replied that he had always been sure that this was what female magicians were called. Raiden just laughed awkwardly in response and explained that she was glad Evan didn't know anything about it. Evan had no idea what Raiden was talking about and tried to recall at least some information about it from the game's plot. Redding explained that witches are half humans whose powers are passed down from generation to generation. She said that they are born with a special gift that ordinary people cannot learn, and moreover, they receive a huge amount of mana and control over it. And then Evan realized that it was not about skills or work, but about hidden species. Redding said that God created them and hid them among ordinary people in order to save the world. But Redding herself did not know much about it. Evan thought this was very similar to the story of demigods, so he became interested in the information. Redding said that at first she traveled the world, but then when she fell in love with the Marquis, she realized that she no longer needed to interfere in world affairs. And then she decided that she wanted to live her life as an ordinary person. Evan was extremely surprised because this was the first time he had heard about it in all his time playing the game. And what's more, there had never been any mention of anything like it. Evan clearly remembered that there had been no mention of the existence of a race of half-humans anywhere. But suddenly he realized that there was only one explanation for this, and remembered sequel. He realized that another part of the game had been released, and that this could explain everything. But Evan could not have imagined that his mother would become a key figure in the 5th part of the game. Redding said that a new witch was born from her marriage to his father, but that it was not a girl. Redding explained that this was precisely why Evan did not possess magical powers. And then she said that when she met Belua, she realized that she was a girl capable of awakening her witch powers. Evan understood that this time, Belua would gain greater power than she had achieved in the 3rd part of the game. And after Raiden told her son everything she knew, she asked him to tell her his secrets. Evan understood that it would be appropriate to share his secrets with his mother, as she was a key character in the game. And so Evan told his mother everything he knew before entering the game and after, in great detail. Time passed, and Evan was almost 13 years old at that moment, and everyone considered him extraordinarily handsome. But despite Evan's beauty, everyone was confused by his strange hand movements all the time. Even stranger were Evan's training sessions, where he used Shine as his assistant. And then, in the midst of this strange training session, Shine suggested trying again. Shane made all kinds of faces, accompanying them with strange sounds. Evan, in turn, tried his best to look at him. Evan was sure that not a single muscle had twitched on his face, but Shine said that Evan had just laughed. Evan began to stamp his feet in anger because he had failed again, and Shane didn't understand why all this was necessary. It turned out that this was the 2nd plan for his rescue, which he called the Mask of Indifference, where he would learn to hide all his emotions in any situation. It turned out that a few days ago, Belua had noticed Evan's smile and remarked that his smile lifted everyone's spirits. Suddenly, Evan began to fall to the floor, and Belua dropped her mug of tea and rushed to him. After all, Evan understood that he would soon turn 12, and because of his smile, various variations of death could await him. And then Shine suggested that Evan stop, because his training was completely ineffective. Evan was not going to give up, because on his birthday, all the noble and very important families would gather. Shane then remembered that Eric's birthday was also a grand affair, attended by aristocrats from all over the world, and even famous guilds. Evan was upset not because of this, but because there would be a huge number of female characters there. But Shine didn't see any problem with this, and suggested that Evan befriend those girls, just as he had done with Belua and Mabel. And when Evan tried to explain to Shine that it wasn't that easy to pull off, they were distracted by Belua, who was behind Evan. Evan turned around, and Belua said she had a message for him from the palace. At that moment, Evan began to worry that Belle might have overheard his conversation with Shane. But when he realized that the message had come from that very palace, he clutched his head, realizing who the sender might be. Below said that the Marquis himself had verified and confirmed that the letter was exclusively for young Evan. Evan asked Belua to tell him that the letter was not from the princess, but Belua could not give him such confirmation. It turned out that His Majesty the Emperor wanted to congratulate Evan personally, as stated in the letter. All the servants were extremely shocked that the Emperor himself was coming to visit them. Rumors of his arrival with the prince and princess quickly spread among the servants and butlers. No one understood why the emperor had decided to travel such a long way just to congratulate Evan, and then the Marquis shouted that of course, the emperor was coming for a completely different reason.
The Marquis told his wife that he had already refused the Emperor's proposal of marriage to the princess, but he understood that the Emperor was coming here for that reason.
Suddenly, Redding told her husband that their son Evan was indeed a very special boy.
And then the Marquis said that His Majesty the Emperor would not get what he so desperately wanted.
During the celebration, Evan would announce his desire to become the leader of the Dungeon Knights.
Learning that Evan would risk his own life for the sake of the underground city came as a great surprise to Shine.
Shane said that this job was not at all for aristocrats, and Evan said that this was precisely the reason for his decision.
Evan explained that the only reason the Emperor was visiting was because he wanted Evan to marry his daughter.
Evan understood that if the king was in his right mind, he would not allow this engagement to happen after such a statement about the Knights squad.
Meanwhile, the maids and butlers discussed all the details of serving all the important guests at the event.
Evan appeared and asked Mabel to tell him how the preparations were going. Mabel said that until yesterday, everything had been going perfectly, but because of the Emperor's visit, they had to redo everything.
Mabel thought about directing a light source at the Emperor the moment he appeared, and then immediately turning it off.
Then Mabel started shouting that this was one of the most important days of Evan's life, and that they couldn't let anyone take his attention away. She meant that even if the Emperor took just one step, all attention would still fall on him. When Evan looked at the stage plan, he realized that there was a serious problem.
Evan asked Mabel to explain, because it all seemed completely unreal to him, but Mabel replied that she had thought long and hard about this plan. It turned out that Mabel had invited the most famous minstrels to his birthday party, even though they were very difficult to get. Evan understood that they were present at every important event in the game.
Mabel explained that they were just girls who dreamed of talking to aristocrats.
Moreover,
Mabel explained that she had promised these girls that she would arrange a meeting with Evan.
When Evan looked at the event plan and said he needed to review and revise it himself, Mabel replied that she couldn't let him do that.
Evan told Mabel to tell the girls to perform the most relaxing songs and leave the stage immediately, and that they would divide the event into 2 stages. Then Mabel suggested moving all the fun to the second part of the celebration, and Evan agreed.
Evan then came up with a new plan where he could get rid of the Emperor before he did something strange.
It wasn't long before Evan officially invited all his employees and subjects to his birthday celebration.
But even though it was an honor for the servants, they still didn't understand their young master's decision.
They were all worried that their presence would only ruin everything, but Evan promised that this would definitely not happen. However, Evan noted that they should come dressed in their pharmacy uniforms, and then no one would have any questions about it. When Hannah heard that she would have to be in uniform, she tensed up slightly, and Evan noticed. Evan himself understood perfectly well that Hannah had dreamed of a completely different scenario that could have happened that evening. Evan asked her not to worry, because there was nothing they could do about it, and they would have to be among the aristocrats. Then Evan explained that Servina would also be at the event, dressed as a priest, and Hannah stopped worrying. Evan then said that the celebration would take place in 2 stages, and suggested that they prepare outfits for the second stage. Evan's plan was to send away all the extremely important guests, and then throw a real ball. He decided to prepare festive tuxedos for Ryan, Servina, and Hannah, but he still hadn't decided whose side he was on. Evan also prepared a festive outfit for Bernard, who replied that he understood Evan's plan, but was not interested in it at all. When Evan realized that Grandpa Bernard was not going to come to his birthday party, he turned on the charm and tearfully begged him to come. But Bernard said he didn't want to attract unnecessary attention because the Emperor would be there, not just the Marquis's family. But then Evan decided to remind Bernard that in that case, he wouldn't be able to meet the girls from the cuties. Bernard then said that he would come after all, but would leave as soon as he got bored. Then Evan decided to arrange for various delicacies to be prepared for his celebration, but they wanted to refuse him. But when Evan tasted his food, he noticed the spicy sweet sauce and its wonderful taste. It turned out that the secret ingredient was a special herb from the 21st floor of the dungeon, which is also used to increase endurance. The chef was surprised to hear Evan's knowledge because he added it for flavor, and Evan recognized it just by tasting it. Evan said that it would not occur to an ordinary person to add this herb to a dish, and noted that aristocrats would lose a lot by not trying it. Evan told him that he would be able to demonstrate all his talents to aristocrats and noble families at his birthday celebration. He explained that the tastes of aristocrats are no different from those of ordinary people. And so Evan promised that this man's dishes would definitely appeal to everyone's taste. And when the chef thought about Evan's words, he realized that he definitely liked it when his dishes were praised. Then Evan decided not to stop there and offered to help the chef prepare everything necessary for this. In the end, all the chef would have to do was cook the dishes and serve them at the tables. Since this dish is served straight from the stove, it would definitely attract the attention of the aristocrats. Evan noted the presentation of this dish, because as soon as curiosity took hold of people, it would be his personal victory. It turned out that this was another part of Evan's plan, to later open his own business, producing dishes made from monster meat. And then, without thinking twice, the chef made the right decision for himself and Evan. A kind of excitement flashed in the chef's eyes, and he asked Evan to help him serve such a large number of guests. Evan realized that the time had almost come to open his own meat snack bar, and all that remained was to take care of the details. After a while, Shine came to Evan and apologized for distracting him, but informed him that more boxes had arrived for him. Evan said that the uniforms for him, Lua, and the other demigods working there had arrived. Evan explained that from now on, their uniforms would be their distinguishing feature, and they had to wear them to the celebration. By distinctive feature, Evan meant that they were now candidates for joining his nightly squad. Preparations for the upcoming event were in full swing, as there was very little time left. And when Evan was checking the information about the employees, Mabel rushed up to him. She dragged Evan to his room so that he could get ready for the party while she took care of the rest. When the guests began to arrive, they noted the perfection of the banquet hall, saying it was the best place they had ever been to. Everyone noted that the banquet hall was not pretentious, but nevertheless very luxurious. Bernard suggested that Hannah take a look at the ceiling and pointed out that it cost more than any of the employees' salaries. As Evan prepared for the celebration, Mabel reported to him that all the guests were praising him. Shine was there and told Evan that they were also talking about the raid in the dungeon, which had been unable to advance beyond the 45th floor. And when Evan said he intended to go down into the dungeon and clear it down to the 5th floor, Shine and Mabel were completely shocked. Shane understood that they were talking about the main monster, and pointed out that no one under the age of 12 had been able to defeat it. Shine was sure that the Marquis would not allow Evan to go down into the dungeon, but Evan explained that this was why he said he intended to go only as far as the 5th floor. Evan said he intended to do this together with his night squad, appointing Shine as vice captain. Shane did not fully understand Evan's words, but Evan said that he was leaving all the preparations to him. When the senior maid finished her work and Evan got up from his chair, he looked completely different. Mabel and Shine noticed the change and looked at him with enthusiasm. After that, Evan asked the senior maid to keep what she had heard a secret, and she promised to do so. It wasn't long before it was time to welcome guests to the event dedicated to Evan. Everyone could see that the famous Ferrati family had also decided to honor the Marquis family with their visit. Although it was the birthday of one of the Marquis family members, the entire Ferrati family came to congratulate him. And of course, everyone immediately noticed the girl who entered the banquet hall. Bernard also couldn't help but notice the beauty of Alicia von Ferrati. And Hannah explained that Alicia was as popular as the young Evan. Upon entering the banquet hall, Alicia's brother immediately thought of Belua, who was supposed to arrive accompanied by Evan. But suddenly, Alicia loudly told her brother that she was about to vomit. The fact was that all the men around her looked at her with admiration, even though she was still a very young girl. But Alicia herself, looking around, noticed that she hated absolutely everything here. Her father asked her to wait a little longer, because he intended to take her to him as soon as he appeared. At that moment, Cryo was concerned about how much stronger the young Mr. Evan had become. Since Evan had already been quite strong at the time of their duel, Cryo considered Evan a worthy opponent. Interrupting all further discussion, they announced the host's family, who had appeared in the guest's field of vision. Everyone was curious about the whereabouts of the Marquis' second wife, but they quickly realized that she was probably with the baby. The Marquis took the stage and graciously greeted all the guests, intending to introduce his youngest son, who had just turned 12. And just as Evan was about to appear on stage from the main entrance, the arrival of the Emperor and his daughter Serena was announced. Evan understood that everything was not going according to plan, as the Emperor was supposed to appear later. Then everyone present bowed to the Emperor as required by protocol as a sign of respect. Evan understood perfectly well that the early arrival was due solely to the whim of his beloved daughter, Serena. Suddenly, after the Emperor's appearance, Evan was announced, and he did not keep them waiting long, appearing on stage. Everyone looked at him and realized that even though Evan was born a boy, his beauty eclipsed even his own mother's. Shane asked Evan not to hold his training today, because it might seem strange to everyone, but it was what Evan needed. First, the Marquis congratulated his younger son on his personal holiday. In response, Evan promised his father that he would not disgrace the family name and would always act in the interests of the townspeople. Then the Marquis asked his son what he wanted to do to bring success to their family. And then he said very loudly, so that everyone around could hear, that he intended to become the head of the Nightly Squad and guarantee the protection of the city. Then a discussion began about Evan's decision, because no one understood why such a young boy would want to do this. Suddenly, the Emperor raised his hand to silence everyone and express his opinion. He immediately demanded an answer from Evan and asked him to explain his reasons for this decision. The Marquis then intervened telling the Emperor that Evan had long since chosen this path, and that it had nothing to do with the engagement proposal.
Evan explained that he was ready to take on the responsibilities of a knightly squad, and added that he had already managed to gather people. Then he pointed to his team and said that they were the potential knights of his squad. Evan himself understood that there would be such a reaction to a child like him making such a statement, and that everyone would consider it child's play. And so Evan promised in front of everyone present to bring back the head of the monster from the 5th floor of the dungeon. But his father was furious because Evan was only allowed to go down into the dungeon when he turned 18. Evan replied that by doing this, he intended to prove that this was not child's play, but a conscious and deliberate decision. Suddenly, Captain Michael intervened and said that he would guarantee that they were sufficiently prepared to descend into the dungeon. Of course, no one could ignore him, because he was the captain of the Knight Squad, recognized as the strongest among the warriors of the Empire. He explained that he had been training them for many years, and could therefore guarantee that these guys were strong, pointing at them with his hand. He also added that these guys were talented and would have no trouble clearing the 5th floor of the dungeon. The Marquis flew into a rage after hearing these words, because they meant that his beloved son intended to go down into the dungeon. But the captain of the detachment, in order to calm the Marquis, suggested holding a duel with his knights to test the strength of these guys. Evan watched this and realized that his plan had worked well, because he was the one who had persuaded Michael to say those words. When Evan asked Michael to persuade the knights to give in to them, he understood that there was no need for this, because they were truly strong. The Emperor himself also expressed a desire to watch their duel, addressing the Marquis. Evan agreed and asked the sweethearts to perform a composition appropriate for the occasion. And so, before the start of the duel, they stood facing each other, expressing their complete readiness for battle. Captain Michael said that both weapons and magic were allowed in this duel. And so the duel between Shane, Ryan, and Balua, and the 3 knights on the captain's side, began. Ryan immediately began to use the power of the Defender's Blessing. When Ryan did this, the knights discovered that their weapons had completely stopped responding to them. Working as a team and taking advantage of this moment, Shane also did not stand aside and began to rapidly attack his opponent. At one point, one of the knights noticed that his legs were covered in ice. It turned out that Belua had also begun to use her magic at that moment, standing behind Ryan, who was protecting her. Then, Belua gathered a stream of energy in her hands and directed it straight at the knight, who was unable to move because of the ice. After that, Captain Michael stopped the duel and declared Evan's team the winners. The Emperor also noted that this team was truly strong, and even thought that this was the hidden strength of the Chardon family. All this showed that Evan was doing an excellent job as the team leader, as he had managed to create such a strong squad. But suddenly, the Emperor became curious about how good and strong Evan himself was. Hearing this, Evan realized that he had not expected such a turn of events. Evan looked at the captain with a pleading look in his eyes, but Michael obviously didn't understand and simply wished him luck. Serena, also sitting at the table, waved her hand at him and wished him victory as well. Evan realized that he had no choice but to enter the battle, which was not part of his plan at all. He understood that if he ran away now, he would miss the opportunity to go down into the dungeon. Suddenly, Michael said that he would be Evan's opponent in this fight. The Marquis understood that Michael would certainly not allow Evan to be injured. Suddenly, Alicia, who was watching what was happening, smiled and became interested in watching it all. Just before the fight began, everyone paid attention to the positions taken by Evan and Captain Michael. Their fight began, and something like an explosion was not long in coming. The father covered his daughter Alicia Ferrati with his hand, not understanding what had just happened. Everyone watched the fight and realized that a child of his age was not capable of such power, and assumed that it was the action of the artifact. This was a conversation between Bernard and Hannah, where the grandfather explained to her that his power was not related to the artifact. Bernard explained that it was Evan's own power that the artifacts helped to reveal, but that such techniques had to be learned. Mr. Ferrati understood that young Evan had learned such complex techniques at the age of 12 and was amazed. Alicia also looked at Evan with admiration and considered him a very interesting young man. And then Alicia confessed to her father that she liked Evan. Alicia then told her father that she would like to be engaged to him if Evan himself did not mind. Then, the head of the Ferrati family decided to pull the necessary strings to make sure that their proposal would not be rejected. Suddenly, in the middle of the fight, Evan suddenly felt a chill run through his body. The knight, whose feet were still frozen, asked Lady Belua to remove the ice, but she seemed not to hear him. Evan realized that he had just felt his death approaching. And when Evan was distracted and exposed, Michael took advantage of the moment and attacked Evan. The battle was over, and Michael de Urlach was declared the winner. Evan then said that even though he had lost, he still agreed with the outcome of the duel.
Michael noted that Evan had become even stronger and asked him to pay more attention to what his body was telling him, and then he would become even stronger. The head of the Ferrati family was not even a little jealous of the Marquis de Salon, because it was not only his first son who was talented. He understood that the Marquis's younger son would bring their family even greater success than his son Eric. Then the father turned to Crow with a question about his confidence that his and Evan's powers were equal. But Crow replied that Evan had become noticeably stronger since their last meeting. Then Captain Michael asked the audience if everyone had seen the strength of the young birthday boy Evan. Then the Marquis had no choice but to allow Evan to go down into the basement. But he only allowed them to go down to the 5th floor. Evan then promised his father that he would go down 5 floors, accomplish what he had planned, and return immediately. Meanwhile, Evan plans to ask for permission to go to the 9th floor of the dungeon on his next birthday. After that, the Marquis suggested putting all business aside for the moment and celebrating his birthday properly. Evan understood that one of the downsides of being in a young body was not being allowed to drink alcohol. Suddenly, Serena turned to Evan and said that she was there to keep her promise. She told Evan that she had become stronger and therefore intended to join his nightly squad. Evan did not understand Serena's reasons for doing this and did not understand why she would rush into danger. Suddenly, Alicia expressed the same desire and began to ask Evan about it. Evan didn't know what to do because 2 possible reasons for his death were looming before him again. Suddenly, Shine turned to Evan and said that the Marquis and Count Ferrati and other aristocrats had withdrawn for a conversation. Suddenly, Evan turned away and suggested a change of scenery, apologizing for the fact that it was about to get a little noisy. And when a group of cute musicians changed the mood, everyone immediately wanted to dance. Hannah asked Ryan to dance, and he did not refuse her. When Servina appeared, she was indignant because Hannah had beaten her to it while she was changing. Evan saw this and suggested that Serena ask Ryan to dance next. When Serena asked Evan to dance, he realized that his doom was approaching. As Serena spun Evan around in the dance, she talked about how popular he had become. She also said that she couldn't even imagine that other girls would also be interested in his squad, referring to Alicia. Serena said that she had never been to such a fun event before and compared this party to playing with worms. When the next song started, Serena asked Evan to dance with her again, but he refused. Suddenly, a chef appeared with fragrant treats, and everyone turned their attention to him. Everyone knew that they were eating monster meat, but they couldn't resist trying these delicious dishes. During the duel between Evan and Michael Crow, he realized that he needed to train more to win Belua's heart. Serena was delighted with the dish she had tasted and asked Evan about it because she wanted something like this to be prepared in her palace. For Evan, this request was very convenient, as it was also part of his plan. He understood that if one of the aristocrats liked it, the others would not be left behind. Evan told Serena that she had just tasted grilled monster meat. Evan added that his family guaranteed the safety and quality of the dishes they prepared. It wasn't long before the other aristocrats also approached the chef with the intention of trying the treats. Suddenly, a man approached Evan and said that he was sure that only researchers could appreciate the taste of monster meat. Evan recognized this man as Genian, a member of the Thunderer Guild. He agreed with the statement, but added that it was only a division of elite warriors. He told Evan that his guild was currently in need of new recruits, but Evan flatly refused. Evan didn't even bother to listen further and left to get 2 more servings of meat. Evan understood perfectly well that he had come here for Ryan, so he immediately refused this man's offer. The fact is that Evan knew perfectly well who the man standing in front of him was, and therefore would never agree to his offer. Despite this, the man had a nose for talent, because he immediately understood what Ryan was capable of. Then Evan replied to him again, to make it clear that he was not going to give Ryan to anyone. Suddenly, his expression changed, and he told Evan that he needed to moderate his ambitions because he probably couldn't handle so many fighters. Evan immediately noticed that this man showed his true colors as soon as he was faced with rejection. The fact is that Jinian is the very character who should be eliminated at the earliest opportunity. According to the plot, he will become a traitor to the City of Dungeons in the battle against the Demon King. Suddenly, Evan heard a conversation behind him about how indifferently he had refused Jinian. When Evan turned around, he saw 2 young men in front of him who noted that they had met before. Evan understood that even though the Marquis had told him to rest, it all came down to one thing. The young man introduced himself as Alan, the head of the Wandering Paradise Guild. The girl introduced herself as Daisy, the vice head of the guild. According to the game's plot, this guild values loyalty above all else and tries to protect the city alongside the main character until the very end. Next to introduce herself was Aloha Von Serve from the Phoenix Guild, followed by the vice head of the Shield of the Heart of the World Guild. The heads of various guilds approached Evan one after another, and among them were both helpful people and plot enemies, but Evan could do nothing about it. In response to numerous questions, Evan replied that he was learning skills to help the party in the dungeon and wanted to try out a couple of them. Alan noted that Evan had learned much more than they could have imagined. Suddenly, a girl approached Evan with a proposal to find out where the dungeon ended. Evan replied that their squad had long since set this goal for themselves and had no other plans. Evan said that they intended to explore as many floors as possible in order to gain the strength to protect the people. And that is why Evan replied that he was not interested in completely clearing the dungeon. But Evan really wasn't interested in that, because he had been there many times as a player. Someone in the crowd shouted that all of Evan's decisions seemed as if he knew the value of life. Evan recognized the voice. It belonged to Prince Damien. Everyone was surprised to see him there, because he was the crown prince, Damien El Silkline. When he introduced himself, Evan bowed to him in respect, because he respected and honored him. He said he had come to Evan personally to give him an order. He ordered Evan to value and protect his sister Serena as much as Evan valued his own life. But Evan was cold on this issue and refused him with a cold mind. He did not understand the reason for Evan's refusal and assumed that he did not like Serena. Evan replied that it was completely inappropriate to discuss his preferences at that moment. Evan reminded him that he intended to become the captain of the nightly squad of the dungeons. He said that the lady who would become his wife would literally be imprisoned in the city of dungeons, and if she was not ready for such sacrifices, she should not become his wife. That is why Evan said that marrying the princess was an impossible task. But Serena rushed to hug Evan, saying that she was ready to be with him anyway. When her brother heard that Serena wanted to join his squad, he flew into a rage. Damien then challenged Evan to a duel, in which, if he lost, Evan would be obliged to marry Serena. When Evan realized that battle was inevitable, he began to recall the abilities of the Crown Prince. According to the plot, Damien always used a hammer, but at that moment, he had a different weapon in his hands. Evan understood that the prince was holding an unsuitable weapon, which meant that he was not as strong. Evan said that if he won, the prince would not ask anything else of Evan. When Damien ordered the guards to lend Evan his sword, Evan said he didn't need it. Evan explained that his fighting technique was designed specifically to protect the body from the teeth and claws of monsters. It wasn't long before the start of their duel was announced. After some time and several attempts by Damien to win, he was defeated, and Evan Deschardins was declared the winner. Michael suggested that the prince had suffered internal injuries from the blow. In order to revive the defeated prince, Servina ran up and healed him with her sacred power. Suddenly, Evan approached Damien and asked him to tell him something. Evan said that the sword did not quite suit him and suggested that he consider a hammer as a weapon. Evan asked Damien to listen to the man he had just fought and asked him to try the hammer. Evan said that it was not worth focusing on status because the wrong weapon could simply harm him. Suddenly, Alicia appeared behind Evan and asked him to dance with her. Serena said that if Evan refused Alicia, he would have to dance with her again. When they started dancing, Alicia noted Evan's popularity, and he did the same to her. She replied that she didn't like her popularity at all and said that it didn't matter now. She said that it didn't matter to her at all because she would soon be engaged to Evan. Evan was not happy to hear this and hoped that his father would not allow it. Alicia said that the Marquis would be only too happy about it, which was why he had gone to talk to her father. Evan thought that this simply could not be, because no one would voluntarily agree to give their daughter to the captain of a knightly squadron. But Alicia shocked Evan even more by saying that she had agreed to this condition. She explained her decision by saying that she felt Evan knew everything in the world. She also said that Evan was afraid of her, which came as a complete surprise to Evan, since they had only met twice. Alicia was curious to see how long Evan would be afraid of her, so she decided to stay close to him. Evan considered this too dangerous a situation, and therefore decided to hide behind his bedroom door. When Evan was free from Alicia, Serena also asked him to dance with her. Hannah didn't stay on the sidelines either, and asked to be next in line to dance with Evan. Then he was surrounded by a crowd of girls, each demanding his attention. Evan turned to Belle and suggested that she not stay on the sidelines either and ask Evan to dance. Below decided to take the first step, promising herself to cherish every day spent with her young master. Suddenly, Shine called out to Evan, saying that a young lady wanted his attention and should not be kept waiting. When Evan approached Belua, he realized that she was angry because he had left her alone. Evan knelt down and asked her to do him the honor of allowing him to accompany Belua during the festivities that day. Evan asked her to forget all conventions for today and give him an answer to his question. Belle did not hesitate and gave Evan her hand as a sign of her consent. Creo looked at them and dreamed of being in Evan's place so he could melt Belua's heart. During the dance, Bella told Evan that he was like a noble aristocrat who had the whole world in his hands. When evening came, the Marquis told his son Evan that he had rejected all proposals of engagement. The Marquis said that they had been able to prove to the Emperor the firmness of the intentions of their family, the Chardins. The only problem was that the princess herself would decide to follow Evan. On that note, the Marquis said that the good news was over. The Marquis also said that Ferrati's daughter had probably made her decision, and her father wanted his daughter to be accepted as a future member of the Knightly Order of the Dungeons. The Marquis said that Evan could no longer avoid this issue. The Marquis thought for a moment and decided to ask his son directly why he was so afraid of girls. Evan said he was afraid that someone with bad intentions would hurt him. His father stood up and said that he was not a child and should not shut himself off from society. His father took him by the shoulders and asked him not to give up, even if he failed. The Marquis said that by thinking about himself and others, he would be able to grow up to be a decent person. The next day, Evan was able to prepare a lot of potions. He had not slept all night and was preparing because today they would have to go down into the dungeon, and his condition left much to be desired. When Grandfather Bernard arrived, Evan tried to explain why he hadn't been able to sleep. That evening, Evan calmly got ready for bed, putting on his pajamas and thinking about everything that had happened during the day. When he sat down on his bed, he could see and feel a light in the area of his chest. Then the Mirasol pendant glowed, but this time it glowed in a completely different way. He noticed the door to his room and heard the sounds of slugs coming from there. Suddenly, Serena appeared in the room, thinking that Evan was calling her. Serena shouted to Evan that a new baby would be born soon, and she wanted it, and Evan was very scared. She pointed to the pendant and said that the baby inside wanted to be called. Serena said that her pet Ruby had shared this information with her. Then Evan asked Serena never to burst into the men's bedrooms again. Then Evan stood up and began to summon the slug Serena had mentioned, realizing that this time it would be stronger than before. Suddenly, the slug appeared, and Serena was indescribably happy to see it. It was an ice slug, very different from Ruby's slug. Serena, her eyes burning, asked Evan to give it to her, and Evan did so because she had originally come for it. Serena thanked the slug for being born and named it Lucy. Then Evan asked Bernard to look at the combat beads he had prepared. As long as Evan wore gloves that nullified the effect of weapons, he couldn't make a good hand weapon because it was impossible. Then it occurred to him to create a throwing weapon that he could use with his bare hands, but the effect would be no worse than a hand weapon. At the same time, he could use the reinforcement from the gloves and this long-range combat technique, which meant it was relatively safe. Evan said that the more effort he put into the bead using alchemy, the more powerful its attack would be. And now, the moment had come when our heroes were about to embark on their journey. The Marquis, with tears in his eyes, told Evan that he never thought his son would go to the dungeon at such a young age. Suddenly, Redding put her hand on her husband's shoulder, as if trying to calm him down. Shine and Balua were also ready and waiting for Evan's further instructions. Ryan also said that he would follow his young master anywhere. And then our heroes, led by young Evan, set off into the dungeon in search of adventure. And then Evan promised himself that he would never allow himself to die again and would definitely become an immortal extra.